My name's Michael Selby. I was copied on a few of those emails.
Oh, hey, how are you?
I just wanted to introduce myself.
Yeah, that's
I'm good. I'm
Are you just
good.
for the city?
Yeah, I work for the city. I'm one of the attorneys.
Okay,
So I
gotcha.
was working with Beverly before,
Yes,
and then I forget, I think it was Beverly's attorney
yeah,
that put us in touch, and then you sent an email to Eric, and
Yeah.
I saw your name, so I
yeah,
wanted to
appreciate
just
it. I did have a chance.
introduce myself. You did.
Thank you. Yeah, I
Good.
think with Eric last,
Good.
last Monday, I believe
Good.
it was.
Okay.
Good conversation, yeah.
Good.
Thank you for
Yeah, of course.
cooperation.
Yeah, and Beverly's attorney's been great. It's all been great.
right,
So
good.
anyway,
That's
just wanted to put a name with face.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Got a few people rolling in the top of the hour, and I know we have earmarked some additional time for this meeting, so we'll try and move as quickly as we possibly can. Roll call or intro, we do have new people too, so you want
Yeah.
to do introduction?
Yeah, I think it'd be great if we could maybe go around and have everyone introduce themselves. We have a new member, Dwayne Judd, who's going to be joining the board. So maybe Dwayne, if you want to start us off, you can do a quick introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and then we'll have the rest of the board members introduce themselves, maybe where you're at in your professional journey and how long you've been on VDAB.
As Cyrus said, my name is Dwayne Judd. I have been in Ben a good 4 months.
Nice.
A partner and I bought Mirror Pond dry cleaners in September. I've been in Oregon since 2015, born and raised in Baltimore. I'm a graduate of University of Michigan, so sorry, Ducks. I'm a Big Ten fan, as well as obviously a Baltimore Ravens fan. So we're hopeful this year that Lamar and the team can win at least one playoff game. My background is about 30 years in corporate finance and strategic planning for multiple Fortune 500 companies, most recently with Columbia Sportswear here in Portland. And decided to invest in Bend after a career in corporate finance when the opportunity to buy Mirror Pond as well as the property. So I'm the neighbor with City Hall. It seemed like a really good venture for us, and I've been to Bend a couple times. I'd appreciated the lifestyle here, and happy to be here. And my first choice was to participate in the budget committee because it seemed aligned with my background and experience. But I was told that this is the more exciting.
We're not just going to disclose who said that.
I'm just, I don't want. I won't put Cyrus under the bus so soon, but Cyrus definitely put a thumb on the scale to tell me that this is the more exciting group to be a part of. So, and he also buys great coffee cups, so I appreciate it.
Well, welcome and glad to have you here. In the past, we've had bankers and people really on the finance side, and I think you'll see a few of us are sort of on the opposite side of that. So I think it will be a great addition.
Jillian, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, Julian Taylor, business consultant and executive coach, and I've been on BDAB for a few months, 4 months, 5 months.
Brianna Manfres, I'm with Pinnacle Architecture, so I'm on the pre-development architecture design side. I am one of the owners there, and so running the business, and I've been on BDAB for like 4 years. It's just been this year or 2024 that I became the chair.
And Gary North, R&H Construction, on a GC company in town. Been on BDAB for a little over a year, I think.
Ryan Andrews with Hiatus Homes for real estate development. Here locally, but all around Oregon, we'll do projects. And then I've also gotten involved with a group trying to buy Mount Bachelor in the last couple of months. So, right, because the mountain, because I need another hobby. I've been on this board for about a year and a half. And it's been great.
I'm Mark Cronky. I've been on the board for about a year. I just came to Bend almost 4 years ago now, from San Diego. I'm a Wisconsin Badger, so fellow former Big Ten.
Yes.
Right, now something else.
Yeah.
Anyway, happy to be here and happy to welcome you here. It'll be great.
So are you real estate as well? Because we
No,
have-
I'm actually, I have a business that does finance for public transit.
Gotcha.
Yeah, payments for public transit.
Jen, will you jump on?
I'm up here. I'm on the screen today. I'm so sorry I couldn't physically be there with you guys. I had meetings that went right up until the last second and just lost my drive downtown time. Hello, welcome, new members. I'm Jen Lynch. I also have a background in finance. I'm one of the partners at Portland Seed Fund. We do early stage venture capital. And I have been in Bend for the last 5 years or so, and 20 years in Oregon, a lot of which has been spent in tech and finance. And I am a Northwestern Wildcat, so also a real Big Ten person. I'm a real Big Ten household, and I'm trying to be welcoming to the Ducks, being welcoming.
Okay, great. Looks like we're missing Tierney Booker and Petra today. So next time we'll have them give a brief introduction as well. But thank you all for doing that.
And Brenda's on here, but she's no longer attending. right?
Yes, apologies. That
No, I
that's
just
a
wanna make
typo
sure
if so.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, so, and then we should probably Megan Perkin, Counselor Perkin, if you want to say hi, for anybody that doesn't know, just because I think that it's important that people know who you are. Okay, so with that, we'll move into the approval of December 16th meeting minutes. Anyone in favor of approving those?
I move,
Oh, good. I'll second.
I move that we approve the December 16th meeting minutes.
I'll second.
Perfect. And then, so that's Jillian and Mark. And then all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those are approved. So we'll move into public comment.
Do have a couple people online. We're gonna start with in-person public comment though. We'll still have Katie Brooks and Sarah, are you gonna be joining? Okay, Katie Brooks, CEO and president of the Bend Chamber. And there's a printout as a resource for you guys as well to reference.
Hi, BDAB. Happy New Year. Good to see you all. I just wanted to, I know this agenda is quite full. There's a lot going on right now. So why not add more, right? So council goal setting season is upon us. And I've spoken with you about this before. The letter that we submitted today is to support BDAB raising its voice and making sure that council is aware that we are really interested in adding an economic development goal to council goals this year, this coming biennium. Because for a lot of reasons, it's the backbone of a lot of infrastructure investments. It's our ability to develop commercial and industrial properties, attract businesses. We have partnered a lot with EDCO on this, whom I also think is interested in backing this. And January 14th is council goal setting and a pretty important date for us all. So I'm just here to remind you that if we don't keep the call up, then sometimes these things get lost in the shuffle because council has so much to juggle as they start their new jobs and their new year. So that's my message for you today, and we'll certainly be behind this as well as the chamber and alongside our friends at EDCO. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick reminder on that too. As Katie mentioned, we have the advisory body summit on January 14th. We have a number of BDAB members already signed up for that. Next Tuesday, if you're interested and have not signed up yet, please reach out to me individually or let me know after this meeting and we'll do our best to get you all situated. Anyone else in person that would like to give public comment? Okay, then we will transition to online. Jim Bodeker, would you like to give public comment today?
Oh, yeah, this is Jim. I'm brand new to the whole process, just trying to drink a little from the fire hose. My background is a fair amount of involvement in Ben's entrepreneurial group back in 2010. I'm founder of the original group called Founders Pad. I've been involved in Startup Oregon and a lot of other activities focusing on entrepreneurial, including Ben Venture Conference. I'm fairly active with EdCode, and I was a small business owner from 2010 to 2002 to 2010. Currently retired and looking for purpose.
Great, thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. And if you're going to be at the EDCO board meeting on Thursday, we'll see you there. Next, Linda Miller, would you like to give public comment? Linda Miller, if you can hear us, now's your chance. Okay. Ronnie Woodridge, if you can hear us, now's your time for public comment, please. Ronnie, can you hear us? Okay, I think that wraps up public comment.
Great. So then we will move into the Ben target sector analysis. Damien, there's a few other folks.
Yeah, our consultants haven't yet joined
Okay.
the meeting. So we might need to switch around the agenda items. So if it's okay, Sarah, would you guys feel comfortable going first on transportation fee?
Turn it over to Sarah.
And you guys, I printed out at least a portion of the presentations we're going to be going through and try to put them in order. So it'll be a little out of sync. Top is the target sector report. And then second, you should have some information on the transportation fee. Didn't print out the whole presentation to try to not waste any paper, but printed out the slides that have a little bit more data incorporated into them so you can see them a little more clearly.
All right, as Sarah pulls this up, I'll just introduce myself for the new members. I've known Jillian for the past. My name's Russ Grayson. I'm the Chief Operations Officer / Assistant City Manager for the City of Bend. My portfolio includes community economic development, housing and real estate, transportation mobility, water services. I'm probably missing another one, fleet as well in that, but basically involved in a lot of initiatives around how do we build the city, both from an infrastructure and planning perspective, but also from a development perspective. So you'll probably, for those that have been on BDAB, you probably see me a lot of different conversations around the table, but always I'm here to help and support Cyrus on any questions that you might have on the majority of the issues you're going to see. And then Sarah.
Hello, I'm Sarah Hudson. I'm a senior policy analyst in the city manager's office and have been serving as project manager for the transportation fee project. I was also debating whether to share that I'm an Ohio State alum, which might Big Ten, but
yeah. We give you credit because you won the game.
All right. So in terms of kind of what we're trying to cover today, so I know there was kind of an ask last time, kind of getting some summary data of kind of what are we seeing in phase one on the non-residential side. I think overall a goal for today is to provide additional context and baseline for the conversations that we'll continue to build. So we'll kind of talk about that. We'll also do a data source overview of both NAICS data, so the business classification data, and ITE manual, which is like kind of the industry resource that we'll be using for a lot of this work. So just kind of walking through those just to make sure everyone knows what those are, if there's any questions, because again, that's kind of like foundational to the next conversation we'll be having. And then a big bulk of today, we'll be talking about some case study work that's been done. So other cities, 5 other cities that have a transportation fee, what it looks like in those cities. Because again, it's like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Yes, everything's a little bit different. We'll talk about that, but there's some consistent themes. So just being able to kind of talk talk through that. And then we'll kind of keep an eye on time because I know there's a lot to get through today, but hoping to get through some other considerations that impact overall revenue generation and at least introduce these concepts, get some initial feedback from the group, but around this idea of discounts or exemptions, special unit classes, I'll talk about what that is, and then just kind of talking about mixed use and some of the things that we're seeing in the data there.
All right, so we're going to talk about schedule and for the new members too, if you have any questions, because we're kind of just jumping right into the topic, if you have questions, you can get them to Cyrus or myself. There's a lot of previous presentations that we can point you to kind of get you up to speed if you have questions around what we're talking about, but we're kind of just jumping right into the kind of some of the technical discussions. So just as a reminder, we'll show this again at the end of the presentation, but what we're trying to do is really move towards getting this fee adopted in July. And what that means is we really need to start providing recommendations to council and get decisions from council in March, April time. So we have enough time to actually implement this on the back end so that when bills go out in August, they have this adjusted fee on it. So what you're going to see as we go through this is Sarah's going to go through, give you a lot of information. We have questions for you about what level of involvement you want to have in these discussions because staff is providing a lot of information. We know that you might have a lot of questions around this. One of the things to think about is if you'd like to have a certain subcommittee to dive into something, or if you have interest and you want to have a deeper discussion on it, we are more than willing to do it. We have 2 more meetings planned with the larger BDAB board at this point, 1 more in February and 1 more in March. So if there's a topic again that you want to say, I would really like to dive in that further, more than willing to do it. Otherwise, we'll kind of continue to give information at the level that Sarah is going to provide to try to keep this conversation moving on the time frame that we're trying to do. But again, if you want to dive into deeper topics, let us know and we're more than willing to do that.
All right. So kind of just getting into the data. So this is just to frame up. So in phase 1, where we are right now, this is the non-residential account summary. I think it's helpful just to keep in mind, what are we seeing? What's like kind of the mix of accounts? So 96%, so most all of the accounts are under 50,000 square feet. To break that down further, about 1/3 of all accounts are under 5,000 square feet, 2/3 under 10,000, 84% under 20,000. So I think that's just helpful because we know we have these outliers where they're really high square footage accounts, which is how accounts are currently being charged and will continue being a factor in kind of these phase 2 calculations. But that, a majority of the accounts are really kind of on the lower end of the square footage spectrum. And then this table that's shown just kind of breaks down the total number of accounts. So we have, close to 2,300 commercial accounts. And then here's some average billing statistics per month. So the average right now in phase 1 is $80 per month. That's pulled up slightly because the maximum amount any account is paying is just shy of $1,400 a month. So you'd have to imagine that's a very high square footage account that's paying that. The median bill right now is 45. So I think that's kind of a more helpful bellwether of what the average account is paying. So just to kind of provide that context, are there any kind of initial questions about anything presented here?
And that's based on them just like you're just using the flat
Square footage. Yeah.
Right. And then we do have that kind of we use the phrase a lot, softening the tail last year, but like for really high square footage accounts, there's kind of this step structure that if you have above 50,000 square foot, the amount you pay per 1,000 square feet kind of lessens. So I don't know,
Yeah.
but yes.
But I think it's important. What we're trying to do is create a system that's going to hit like 90, like almost instead of the 80-20, almost like the 95-5%. We're trying to find that 95% system that works for 95% of the accounts. And then, there's going to be a handful that we might have some special outliers, but the majority of the accounts kind of fall into those smaller square footages.
Okay, now just to kind of switch gear to NAICS code. So this is the North American Industry Classification System. It's really that standard that's used for classifying where businesses fall, like what the business establishment is. And the reason we're bringing this up is because this is what we're asking for when businesses register with the city. You must identify your NAICS code, and this is verified during registration renewal. And this is how we're getting the business use data. that we're using to, in this phase 2 structure, incorporate what is the business use that's occurring, so we know how to scale the fee. So that's the source of the information that's being provided to the city. Then it's linked to a utility account by address. So that's kind of how that process is happening. I do want to flag that at this point, we're missing NAICS codes for about 900 of our 2,300 commercial utility accounts. And this is due to a few reasons. One, there's kind of a compliance aspect to this. So we have businesses that have not registered their business with the city, even though it's required. We're also pending some renewal. So we started this process in May of requiring that businesses identify what their NAICS code is, because we knew we wanted to use it for the fee, and also that it's important to know the total mix of businesses in the city. So we kind of pushed harder as part of the transportation fee work. So some businesses just haven't come up in their renewal yet. So that's also a piece of it. And then there's some things like a business might have multiple locations, but you're only required to have one registration. So that's some data cleaning that we can do on our end to get that kind of number of missing down. And then there's a kind of a smaller group where it's considered a commercial utility account, but they're not required to register as a business. So something like a school or a church. It's not considered a residential account, so it falls in that non-residential bucket, but they wouldn't register. So just trying to give that framework. We know we need to kind of crack that nut on the compliance side, but also wanted to kind of spell out some of the other things going on. I don't know if either of you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, and I don't, do you have what's the next slide? So I think it's important, and I'll turn to Cyrus here to give more, just a real brief understanding of what this business registration program is supposed to be doing. It's not just intended to be solely for the transportation fee. It does have other purposes. And I also want to ask Cyrus to give a little bit of update of, there might be some other questions around the business registration program that may come back to BDAB in the future, just so you can have some contextual kind of understandings of how it relates to transportation fee.
Yeah, so our licensing team in our community and economic development department is responsible for managing this specific program for business registrations. So you kind of just see how it's situated organizationally. The revenue that we receive from business registrations does fund the business advocacy program and my position. So that is a very big example of where those funds are going. For the compliance issue, we do have a code enforcement team that code enforcement team addresses these non-compliance issues on a complaint-based kind of reporting system. So you'd imagine not very many people are getting a complaint because they don't have a business registration. So code enforcement hasn't necessarily had a strong presence in strengthening that compliance ratio. Licensing staff, so say a business is coming through and wants to apply for a sidewalk cafe license. They'll do some cross-referencing to say, well, you don't have a business registration, so you need to get that before you can apply for X other thing. So there is some cross-referencing that helps with the compliance there. It has been identified as a program that the licensing team wants to kind of modernize in the future. And that would be something that we would work with BDAB on, where we can make improvements to have it work better for the business community.
What's of the previous slide, what's the general, if you have the actual breakdown of that, is it like unlicensed businesses are 10% of the 900 that you're talking about, or is it like 95% of the number that you're talking about?
Well, the 900 represents where we don't have a.
Right, so then the breakdown of all the reasons that those are unquantified, what's like the biggest contributor to those?
I would say significantly the unregistered businesses. Okay. And part of the conversation too is to remediate some of this compliance, what do we do? Yeah. And that's going to be a question that we want to give you some options about how we can handle that and move forward, because with the transportation fee assessments happening, they're going to get put in a bucket. So which bucket is it?
So there's that, and then also I think you'll see in the next presentation by Damon, you'll understand there's some more relationship of these codes with how we look at target sectors. And so it is an important piece of information to gather. And again, it gets compliance with the program. But as Cyrus said, yeah, we need to figure out if we do go to like a tiered bucket system, you do not have a code, what tier do we put you in to try to also drive compliance with the business registration program as well? So hope that makes sense.
How does it relate to the previous slide with, so you've got 16% that are 20,000 square feet and higher. Do we have a pretty good sense on that group?
We can look into that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that specific data. I would assume more on the higher side that we probably have business registration because they're more prominent.
That'd be my
businesses.
guess. And I think that's an important piece because that ties into those folks paying more money, right?
Yeah, and we just want to make sure what's important to us is to know, okay, well, we need to make some assumptions on the businesses that we don't have accounts for to make sure that our revenue generation is correct. So simple questions like, well, what do we put them in a higher bucket to compliance? Do we make our target revenue allocation a little bit higher, knowing that we may back off of that as we get more information? So those are the type of questions that we want to work with BDAB to get good recommendations on.
And that was kind of the point, because year one was only square feet, because that's all we had.
Yeah.
Right.
Now we
have square foot
Now we have
intensity.
more information.
Yeah.
But that more information is a little bit flawed, as we're seeing today, because 40% we don't.
Yeah,
have it.
but also we are kind of in midstream, almost in the midpoint of that business registration renewal process.
true.
So hopefully we'll see that number window over the next couple of months. But in terms of modeling, we do need to make some high level assumptions to at least give you some kind of good rate model alternatives.
Speaking just that timeline, we need to give the consultant enough data to be able to make enough progress with what she's doing currently to be able to have that July 1st implementation date. So we need to give her enough to work with to get that process going.
So I think that's probably one of the questions we'll be coming back at the next meeting with is, okay, we've done a couple of preliminary model runs to get some understanding. Here's some high level kind of direction and guidance we need on what assumptions do we put in around the ones that are not registered to make sure that you can make a good policy decision on what to recommend.
And can you explain how you're going about the renewal process, communicating that and making sure folks realize they need to do that?
Yeah, so just to clarify, having businesses include their NAICS code in the business registration workflow was already happening.
Mm-hmm.
We just internally added an additional step where I personally am looking at every single business registration and verifying that NAICS code to make sure that we are providing accurate data to the consultants.
Okay.
So it was always,
It was always there, and
Okay.
to what level it was verified, I think we just wanted to be extra confident that the data was clean.
so then the May renewal isn't as significant if it's always there, it's just a validation of all current.
Well, I think people will be looking at it closer as in theory, because there's going to be appeal process. If you're not category, you're not in the right category. There might be more discussions we have around, well, what verification process do we do on your business around the code?
Is the square footage accurate for the business, the unknown or unregistered businesses?
They're accurate. We're taking that information off the dial from the county, and there's already an appeal process set up in the structure to say, if you don't agree with that square footage, which I know some accounts have come back and asked. So again, as it leverages up again, we might get more questions on not only the NAICS code, but also the square footage as well as we go through this.
How many errors did you find?
It was less than I anticipated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dwayne, did you have a question?
I did. So, two questions. One, so as you're looking at square footage, and if there's multiple locations, does it become a cumulative charge?
We look at basically per property.
Gotcha.
So yeah, you would be charged on each property, but we don't look like if you have the same business in this location and also the same business on that location, we don't aggregate that square footage.
Got it. Okay. And the second question is, the NAICS code is used as a proxy for consumption. Is that correct?
Yeah, we'll get into that in the next couple slides here to tell you how we're going to relate that now to impact.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
On this graph, we're just showing of kind of the business registrations. What is that data summary? What's kind of the breakdown of businesses we're seeing? And again, I think it's just helpful to have this as background to kind of know when we kind of do get into the specifics of the fee structure of kind of knowing what is the mix of businesses that we're really seeing in the city. So the graph shows kind of the high level grouping because NAICS codes roll up to kind of these more umbrella categories. So you see professional, scientific, and technical services, construction, healthcare and social assistance, administrative support and waste management and remediation services, and so on. And then the boxes to the right kind of show examples of within each of those categories, what are the most common specific types of businesses. So for example, under professional, scientific and technical services, law offices are kind of the top one there, followed closely by accounting services and engineering services. So it's kind of more in an office space. And then construction, commercial building construction, residential remodeling. So I'm not going to read through every one, but just trying to provide that kind of breakdown of what we're really seeing as the business mix here. All right, and so next we're going to switch gears to what the ITE manual is. So we're kind of making this jump. So the NAICS data is the data that we have and that we're receiving. And then to kind of make that translation to kind of a transportation fee structure, we need to connect the dots to the ITE manual. And it's not a one-to-one. They're two different sources, but NAICS is being used for other things too. Like we'll talk about the target sector. So that's where some of the fun connect the dots happens.
And yeah, and I'll talk a little bit through this. So I'm an engineer by background, so just bear with me. So what we're trying to do, as Sarah alluded to, is correlate intensity of the business and its impact on the transportation system. And as she goes through the examples, you're going to see a couple different examples, but majority of them kind of use, well, what's your trip generation? And you can imagine like a gas station or a fast food restaurant is going to have a lot higher trip generation than an accounting office would have. And so there's, there are different approaches to this. We've seen some cities, they at one point used parking as kind of as one of the queries they would use for that kind of data. We don't have parking minimums or maximum. We have parking maximums. We got rid of parking minimum standards. So that really doesn't apply looking forward into the future. We let the market more decide what they want to park on their property. So the general kind of engineering approach to this that we utilize when we do traffic studies. So if you're coming with the development, those of you in the development world, you have to do a traffic impact analysis. And we have what's basically called the IT manual or the Institute of Transportation Engineers manual that says through surveys they've done across the country for that kind of look at the law of averages of if you're this type of business or this type of development, how many daily peak hour trips are you going to put on the system? That is what is our standard for our traffic impact analysis. It's our standard for what we use for a lot of our large transportation modeling. So that's why from a staff perspective, we're kind of recommending syncing these two things together because this is the best available data we have to type of business and kind of impact on a more consistent platform of trips on the system. And these are vehicular trips. They're not multimodal trips, but vehicular trips. But it's our best way to kind of link those two together from the research that we've done. So now the trick is using this, and we're open to other comments or suggestions around this, but if we go down this, is linking the NAICS codes, that coding system to the ITE manual system to kind of make that crosswalk so that we can actually come up with the buckets of which businesses go into each tier of charges. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, question for you. Is a trip or is there a trip unit? Like, is a 10-mile trip the same as a 2-mile trip?
In a trip is a trip.
A trip is a trip.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can get into layers of complexity around that because there's pass-by trips for those of you in the development world. There's a lot of different things we can do, but we're trying to find something that is kind of easily implementable across the board and is fair and consistent because there are a lot of things you can do in the transportation world, but we're also trying to create an equitable system that we can use across 2,300 different categories of businesses.
So like an office building that has somebody commuting in the morning and then their car is there all day and then leaving in the evening, that's 2 trips.
That is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so when you think about like a single family house is the best way to analogize this. It basically, for the peak hour, we always look at from an impact, you look at the peak hour, that's between basically kind of 4 to 6 in the evening. A house would have 1 trip, but it puts 10 daily trips on a system. So usually it's peak hour trips and average daily trips. We would be using the average daily trips number in this analysis.
And just to expand on kind of what you referenced, like pass by or diverted link. So there's also kind of terminology and analysis within this that kind of considers, is this trip likely to just be a unique trip that someone just makes to do that trip or something that you do along the way to something else or, so all of that is kind of baked in to.
Like a cleaners would, a lot of times it'll account for, oh, you're not just going to the cleaners and back home. Usually you're dropping off your dry cleaning and then you're going to another, like your work. But your work would be a dedicated trip back and forth.
So to that point though, 10 trips during peak hours is the same as 10 trips outside of peak hours.
No, it would be for a house, it'd be one trip in the peak hour was what a house would generate, and 10 trips over a day. 10.
Here's what I'm saying. In terms of the definition of consumption, are we saying that 10 trips during peak hours is equivalent to 10 trips outside of peak hours?
No, it's going to vary across all the different categories.
Okay.
So a lot of times you have a lot more that would create much more generation in a peak hour than they would over the day.
Okay, good.
And that's what that manual is trying to adjust to. And what they do is they actually go out across the country and they do actual physical counts of how many people came in and out of this business during the day and during the peak hours. So it has a lot of different data, kind of segregation of data.
Are there other communities that have used these two data sources to try and make this match?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And that's why one of the reasons from a staff perspective, is why we're recommending linking these two together, because it's, from what we've seen, it's kind of the best industry standard to try to solve this specific question.
Thank you.
You can.
One other question. So we cities have implemented this from year 0 to year 5 or 3. Was there ever a change in the intensity after companies started to get charged?
Yeah, that's one of the things we'll be asked. It's a great question. And yes, the transportation morphs over time. We're also trying to figure out how do we create a system that we can continue to manage in the future as well. So what's our baseline? How often should we go back and recalibrate that? That'll be kind of some of the questions that we'll probably be asking for recommendations. Like, should we be looking at this every 5 years, every 10 years to make sure that as the transportation system evolves, do we need to reallocate the fee?
It is indeed true that if you want to improve something, measure it. But if you want to reduce something, tax it, right? So as soon as you start putting a tax on something that's being used, folks will figure out how to game it.
Yeah, and so that's one of the, and what we're trying to figure out is not a tax, it's a fee, but
Sorry.
yeah, we want to be careful with the language.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's trying to figure out the goal is we're trying to create revenue to operate and maintain the system.
Yep.
Right. So that is what this fee is trying to generate. Now, when we look at discount and incentives, that's what we're going to be. There's another discussion of, well, what do we want to do? Knowing if we do one thing, well, then does it create less revenue to operate and maintain the system? So we want to make sure that, like, what goals are we trying to achieve? And what policy objectives are we trying to achieve? And does that work within the system we're creating?
That's right.
Great question, Phil.
I think you might have just touched on this, but mine was going to be around sustainability of like reduced trips. And then at what point are you not generating the revenue because there's less vehicles on the road and then you're not doing what you're intending to do?
Right. So, and this is this fee helps all modes of travel. Right. And again, we've been asked questions of, well, I have one car, or I don't have a car, and my neighbor has 10 cars. But also think about, we cannot manage to regulate that on a yearly basis in a perpetual system forever. Right. That is where we would spend half the fee just with staff managing that. So we're trying to figure out the balance of what's the right regulatory process to achieve the goal, to get the revenue in, to maintain the system. So that's the balancing act here.
They're going to do a quick time check because we have a lot more slides to get through and we'll have more opportunities for questions. Jen, do you want to give a quick question now and we'll keep moving?
I'm curious about what external data sources you've leveraged in trying to figure out these vehicular impacts. Like, do you use ODOT data? Do you guys have access to, a giant database? Do you're able, or could you purchase something? Like, are there third-party ways of doing traffic assessment that is not this sort of rubric based estimate?
So from just traffic, and I will tell you that this is the industry standard for traffic modeling, traffic engineering, transportation impacts for development. This is almost every city in the country uses this IT manual. I would say there's not a direct industry standard of how you translate that to a transportation fee. But this is for us from a business and its impact on the transportation system. This is probably the best outside third-party industry standard that we have to work with, and the most complete source of data that we have. Yeah, and again, this just kind of gives you kind of how that is set up. It's basically set up similar to how the transportation fee is per 1,000 square feet, and you can start to see different uses have different types of trip generation rates in terms of impact. So the question we're going to be asking you if we continue down this road of this type of model is, okay, as you start to see that graph, then where do we start to create what we call the buckets or the tiers that we're going to use to assess impacts? And then we'll start taking those NICS codes and say, okay, you're in bucket 2, you're in bucket 3, you're in bucket 4, based off of where those strata lines are in their trip generation.
I guess just to pause here before we go into the case study research, if there's any kind of immediate questions about NICS or ITE, or we should keep moving.
Yeah, can I just make a comment? I think something that came up that both you guys reference. You guys both you reference if you want to change behavior, tax it, and you reference what happens if. Yeah. I mean, the principle, and Brandy, you mentioned like people's changing behavior. That would only get captured if the trip generation manual changed, or the only incentive is really for companies to change their NAICS code over time. They'd be like, oh, wait, I'm actually not an office. I'm a or I'm something else. They would, lie or update or clarify what their NAICS code is in order to jump into a different bucket.
Right.
If they knew, that's the only incentive that we're creating. We're not saying if you actually generate less trips, you're going to pay a lower fee, because we're not counting actual trips.
Well, that's one of the things in terms of, you look at incentives, that's one of the questions that's out there, but I would say there's kind of administrative
Burden to
be able to.
I think we talked about that a year ago of like, could a company, challenge or appeal their bucket and say, but I told all my I let my employees work from home 3 days a week. So
yeah,
give us a warehouse level bucket.
Or do you go back to what you had said of it's all modes of transportation, and so it's bike paths, it's all of those things, and you're saying this fee is for the greater good. This is the math behind it, but $100 is $100, whether that goes to a road pothole or a bike path.
Right. Yeah.
Not that $100 is gonna pay for it.
But and what's up? We have something to talk about incentives here. Yeah.
Okay, so to switch to case study research, and I know just being sensitive to time, I'll try to do kind of a quick run through of this. There's also a really detailed memo that we can send out to the group afterward that really goes into kind of the fun details, but I'm trying to kind of high level it in this section. So for the case study research, the purpose here is we're really like learning from how other cities have approached this fee so that we can model practices for our city, knowing we can't just kind of pick one up and put it here, but kind of giving us some ideas and some framework. So we got information from 5 other Oregon cities: Ashland, Hillsborough, Lake Oswego, Medford, and Hillsborough. And there's over 30 cities in Oregon that have a fee like this, but we chose these 5 based on population size, industry diversity, kind of geographic distribution in the state, and their general fee structure approach. They also have some sort of grouped use type of approach. And then just to kind of serve as an intro, quick comparison of population, the year the fee went into effect, and the estimated annual revenue. So just kind of having that background here. I think a takeaway is, yes, we're going to vary in size and then estimated annual revenue. So just, if you see a fee that looks lower, don't just take that as, oh, they, charge less and they can do it. They have different goals, different size. So just having that context. But on a per capita basis, I don't think it's really that different. Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just noticed that Lake Oswego did have a fee, so never mind, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it got added.
No, that's, I was just like, why from
we found the
2003 did it take them that long to calculate what's happening?
We found the information. Okay, so I'm just going to go through alphabetical order. So Ashland, the table on the right shows what the fee structure is. Again, we'll have a memo if you really want to get into the details, but kind of trying to high level some of this information. So they have 8 customer classes, so 8 different kind of grouped uses, and they do a charge per 1,000 square foot for those 8 customer classes. And then they do kind of special unit classes. So types of business use that are charged on a non-square footage type basis is what we mean by that. So they have kind of a catch-all bin where that particular business use is charged per number of required parking spaces as per the Ashland code. They also charge hotel and motel per room. So that's kind of a couple things they do differently. They have exemptions for churches and places of worship do not pay the fee. And the minimum commercial fee, so no commercial account pays less than what a single family residential household pays. So kind of high level over there. And it looks like I think what was it? They adopted theirs in 1991. So sometimes it's hard to go back and kind of know the genesis of some of this, and documentation isn't always great. But it looked like the original basis of their fee structure kind of started in a parking space kind of model and then kind of morphed and evolved over time. So that was what we were able to uncover, but just kind of wanted to show some cities approach this differently. For Hillsborough, which is an example we bring up a lot because they're a similar size city, they have 6 customer classes or bins, and this is based on trip generation, the ITE manual, and they're charged per 1,000 square foot. So sometimes you'll see in the slides we use KSF or 1,000 square foot. They're the same thing. They also have kind of a base charge, like $8 to $10 per month base, and then this cost per 1,000 square feet is layered on top of that. They do have fee caps for their high trip generation bins. So for bins 5 and 6, which are kind of higher volume of trips on the system and would have a higher cost per square foot, they capped that and kind of redistributed the cost to the lower buckets to try to mitigate some of that impact for those high trip generators and then spread it out a little bit. So just kind of pointing that out there. That's something we want to talk about as this group of kind of this idea of fee caps. Is there any like kind of highest amount a business should pay, which we'll kind of get into down the line. They have also this kind of bin 7, which is just kind of a mixed bag of their special unit classes where different types of uses are charged a rate per unit, and it's really like itemized in their fee structure, but things there are like kind of an acreage based system for city parks or state parks. And they also do hotels and motels per room, if I recall. So things like that. In that memo that we can share out, it kind of spells all of that out. They do have some non-residential discounts. So if the employer offers a transit pass or participates in the eco program, they have a slight discount. But in talking to Hillsborough staff, they're planning on phasing this out. They don't get uptake in these programs, and they said they're very administratively cumbersome. And so they're trying to phase it out completely. So I just want to note that it was something they attempted to do, but just didn't get a lot of participation in and found it created a lot of admin work. Another note here is that they do expect fee increases due to Intel and Genentech strategic investments sunsetting. So it seemed like because Intel and Genentech are in Hillsborough, that they kind of provide some kind of capital funding, and they were able to offset some of their transportation utility fee. But with those sunsetting, that's kind of changing the mix, and they have to generate more from their transportation utility fee. So they have kind of a planned few-year kind of fee increase to help offset.
And I don't think we were not in a similar situation here in Bend with any type of arrangements with the business community around that.
Just curious. So because Intel specifically has this very large campus and footprint. So where would they fall in this bucket here? It's hard to tell what the code is there.
That's a good question. I'm not sure, and I don't know what their particular kind of arrangement is with this strategic investment that's sunsetting. We could try to.
Could it be probably classified as manufacturing, so they'd probably in theory be in one of the lower tier buckets, but they just have a really large square footage attached to it.
I guess what I was curious about is you have a campus like Intel, and then you also have Topgolf. And I was just kind of curious about how those two different entities would fare like in this rate schedule here. Would Topgolf have a similar or more, or would it be less than given?
We'd have to, it's layered, and we can have, if you want to have further conversations, we can, because you'd be on the square footage of the building that we'd be charging, right? Not the entire square footage of the golf establishment. So
The trip count.
yeah,
I mean, that's right.
the intensity would be higher, but your square footage would be
Actually
lower.
averaging a similar fee.
Yeah. And we have some, I mean, Sarah in a previous presentation had some comparisons that kind of laid this out of, a much smaller fast food restaurant equates to a much larger warehouse, and they're paying the same exact fee. Kind of thing. That's the intent of what it's trying to show.
Okay, Lake Oswego, they have 3 customer classes based on trip miles, charged per 1,000 square feet. So kind of goes to show you can some have a lot of buckets, some have a few. This is an example where there's just 3. They have exemptions. So waivers for vacant property where water service is discontinued, and then for parking lots, park and ride lots, things like that. We currently actually don't charge unless if it's a developed property, so you need to have like an actual structure on the property to be charged the fee right now. So just want to note that, because you'll see in a couple places, they kind of explicitly say they have exemptions for that, but we're not charging the fee for things like that right now.
Even if it's like a parking garage or a parking.
Parking garage, I don't think.
It has a water utility account.
Okay, yeah, but not parking lot. Yeah, if there's like a
A
structure.
surface lot, yeah, a surface lot would not.
Yeah. For Medford, this is, I would say, the most complicated of the fee structures, and I don't even know if I should try to talk through it, but I think, again, to give an example, we'll send the memo out, but like how specific you can go when you're trying to achieve kind of equitable charge, but it's so administratively kind of difficult or hard to know as a business how much you specifically pay. They take a unit of measure multiplied by a modified average daily trip rate. They take the pass by factor, and then they have a non-residential rate. So there's like 3 components to the charge. And I've been steeped in this, and I have to say it took me a bit to understand it. So I just want to kind of flag that. But they do have 22 kind of customer bins that are charged per 1,000 square feet. And then they have a number of special unit classes. So examples here are gas stations per fuel position, hotel motel per room, things like that, things that aren't conducive to that square footage fee structure. They do have a non-residential discount, so a 50% reduction for the headquarters or main office of nonprofits, places of worship, or fraternal organizations, not any satellite locations, but their headquarter or main office, 50% reduction. And then they have a minimum commercial fee equal to a single family residential rate.
Is there any magic to why they make the most revenue and they're not necessarily the biggest? Like, because they have a more complex, or is that
Maybe.
just because they need it to raise more, so they
Probably need to
Or
raise
their
more.
base fees are probably higher, just the base assumptions.
I remember talking to someone from Medford, might have been last year at this point, but I think just kind of, they said it took a while to kind of get this fee structure in place. I think it achieves a feeling of like a little more fairness, but they said it was very complex to administer. And I think it took, just a long
Yeah,
time.
maybe they need to raise the most money so they can pay the staff,
Right.
and then still have a little bit left over.
Right. They're also looking for 5 million, but it's
Right.
7 because.
Yeah.
of the administrative fee.
Sorry, that's good review out of, all right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Going back to this one?
Yeah, it does all the comparisons. These are fees net of incentives and discounts. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, that's like the total amount they're generating.
Right. And so it's kind of hard to your question. They may have the highest revenue, but the least incentives and discounts. And for example, at Hillsborough, there may be some very savvy companies there that are striving to sort of build in incentives and discounts that reduce it a bit. So it may be helpful to see, if you can get a schedule that also says what's the value of the incentives and discounts.
Right.
As well.
Yeah, I'd be interested to learn that from Medford, like for Hillsborough, for example, kind of learn that like a handful of businesses participate, so it doesn't have a huge revenue impact, but for Medford, given that they have a 50% discount, we can inquire further for, how many actually apply for the headquarters or main office of nonprofits.
Right.
And then the last one to run through is Newburgh. They have 5 of those bins that are based on trip generation and charge per 1,000 square feet, 19 special unit classes, similar, gas stations per fuel position, hotel motel per room, school per student. And then they lay out exemptions for waivers for vacant properties or exemptions for parking lots. And then they have a non-residential discount where they have a rate for schools that's reduced by 50%, which is something similar to what we did already in phase one. And they specifically don't have any fee caps there. They discussed it and decided, no, we will not kind of cap the fee for anyone. And then just to kind of go through key takeaways. So yes, it's all, there's some different shapes and sizes, but I think a few kind of summary things here. For each city, first and foremost, there's a funding gap because the needs for services are outpacing city revenue growth. The transportation fee is not the only thing they're doing. It's one of the tools to try to address that. There is a wide variation in the fee structures and the categories, but I think we can all note that there's a consistent approach of grouping similar types of uses together for the purposes of charging things that kind of act similarly. Special unit classes are commonly utilized. Yes, like the amount varies a little bit, but it's something that's commonly done for things like hotels and motels and schools per student. Non-residential discounts and exemptions are rare, except, in a few cases it was for undeveloped properties, which we had already discussed, that we don't charge the transportation fee on kind of the undeveloped property that doesn't have a structure on it. All cities reviewed have an appeals process. We have one in place. We would continue to suggest using that into this phase. And then just a note that because a lot of these cities have had these fees in place for a long time, it can make kind of the original considerations hard to know, or what was it like at implementation. We kind of know what it's looking like now, but we don't always have the wisdom of like, how was it for you in that first year or two, or how did you kind of navigate those things? Just because that institutional knowledge is not always there. I guess to kind of talk about questions here, kind of want to pause and know if there's any questions or concerns with the overall kind of proposed approach of us linking the NAICS to ITE and this kind of grouped use fee structure.
So my quick takeaway is that's the smartest thing to do based on what you've shown us. So I assume you're leaning more towards kind of a Hillsborough model. That makes a lot of sense from a data standpoint. If I think back to last year, we had square footage. Now we're supposed to have more data to make better decisions, and the next one even improved upon that. So I'd be a little curious, maybe not today, but where the next data set is going to come from that's going to be better. I am still a little bit concerned. Do we have good data? For two reasons. One is the 40% that we don't have the registered codes, which for various reasons you described. The other one is that manual, 2021, last time they did it, there's been a lot of business changes, especially the way people go to businesses nowadays since 2021. But we have to use the data we have. And so I'm telling you, I think you're spot on the direction to go.
It's good feedback.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think tying the two together makes sense. It gives the two data points that we're looking for. So I'm also in agreement with that. I think there's probably some conversations around what that means, because so that you don't get into some of the conversations that we were having of like, if I don't have transportation, if I've incentivized less trips, that really it's about equity across the community and having all modes of transport. Like, I think there's a difference in messaging there versus like somebody just thinking about a vehicle and what that impact does. I think it makes sense for measuring it because the rest I would imagine gets really messy. You're starting to count bicycles or something. I don't know.
Yep.
But so I'm in general in favor of using those two to quantify the fee, how it gets rolled out and what that messaging is for what those dollars are used for. I think should not necessarily be boiled down to the methodology behind why it's calculated that way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think some data about the impact on the consumer side.
Mhm.
I don't know what that would look like, but a yard of concrete from Hooker Creek, over time, like in 2 years from now, what's that yard of concrete going to cost me versus what it cost me today? Because obviously that cost is getting passed on, right? So is there a way to sort of, and it won't be exact, obviously, but is there a way to understand And a business like that, like Hooker Creek, I don't even know how big their office building is a couple thousand feet. And they're making
so many
a
trips.
bunch of trips a day
Yeah.
with large trucks and, I don't know what that looks like, but at the end of the day, I'm paying more for a yard of concrete one way or the other. So just and for a restaurant, we're gonna be paying X cents or dollars more for a hamburger, all that kind of stuff. Is there a way to kind of figure out, once you understand the methodology, to break that down into a business case to say, restaurant is gonna be added X number per month?
Yeah,
X
I mean,
dollars
we can say, we can kind of give some high level law of averages based off kind of like what we're seeing with the accounts, when you go back to that original slide where she had the mean and median, effectively, if we did nothing, we're doubling the fee to go from a $5 million generation to a $10 million generation. So in theory, we're going to be back in that same kind of ballpark of doubling those base fees. I think it's just going to get reallocated a little bit differently across all those businesses. So some may go up and some may go down, but you're looking at on average, $60-$80 a month charge on your utility bill to put it in for majority of the businesses.
One of the things that I wanted more data on potentially is just when we say, like, even the 50% for schools, the reduction, like, what number is that? Is that $1 million? Is that
Yeah, we can give
$500?
that, yeah.
And so as we look at other incentives of, recommending those, knowing what the impact is and how that will be redistributed, I think will be really helpful.
Sarah, do you have on a later slide kind of what council's direction was based on?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, I know we're at 1 and there's more to get through. Maybe we kind of go into the exemption discount discussion at the high level because
Yep.
it has some impacts on work that's taking place, and then we can kind of table.
Yeah, so I just what this means is we will continue to work with our consultants to say, hey, based kind of using the Hillsborough model, which is kind of from staff, we're kind of seeing similar to how you're seeing is give us a couple different scenarios now in some model runs to figure out how would this look? Where does that come and where might some logical breaks should be? Should we be at 3 categories, 5 categories, 10 categories, that type of stuff, and bring those examples back to start having a conversation. So really, we're just trying to be able to present you something about what the true impact would be. And this is one of those first questions we need to kind of at least give high level direction to our consultants on.
So if I kind of jump to that, because a few of those are discounts, exemptions, especially in a class as mixed use, but discounts and exemptions kind of being the biggie here. So we did have a discussion with council at the beginning of December, the work session around this. And then just a reminder of what we're kind of offering currently in this general area. There was a rate adjustment for K-12 public schools that's reflected in phase 1 rates. And then there's a 50% fee reduction for utility billing assistance account. So that's on the residential side. That's currently offered. And then council direction at that time when we had that discussion was for anything we do on the residential side, continue to align it with utility billing assistance, knowing that it needs to be kind of overall kind of programmatic and not transportation fee specific. But on the non-residential side, kind of wanting to explore some options with BDAB, some things that council expressed interest in looking into further was childcare facilities. That's something we currently have an exemption for on the SDC side, and then deed restricted affordable housing. And the reason that deed restricted affordable housing appears here as a non-residential item and not a residential item is because really that benefit is to the operator, and it doesn't kind of trickle down the way that utilities are charged in those developments to the resident. So it's more of a kind of consideration on the operator side that kind of already work with maybe thinner margins of like having this fee. So it's kind of in this non-residential bucket. So those were a couple items that council expressed interest in looking into but the discussion here for this group is kind of, I think, an initial temperature check around, is there anything else we should be looking at? Is there interest in looking into these? I think it kind of also goes back to a discussion we had earlier of, there's also this overall revenue generation target where, we still have to kind of meet those goals. So if we kind of offset costs for certain groups, does that get redistributed? Do we forego revenue? So there's a lot in there, but kind of wanted to get any initial thoughts or kind of temperature from the group.
I was gonna say it soon.
If I
Yeah, go ahead.
could just clarify too, just want to make sure it's clear. BDAB's recommendation could be to pursue looking at one or both of these two options that council had mentioned, looking at a different potential incentive or discount, or just saying we don't want to recommend there be any exemptions or discounts for non-residential accounts. So just want to clarify that those are kind of the options that we can pursue.
I think I want to hear what the target sector analysis is,
Yeah.
assuming there's some like background there on the type of businesses that would be. Like, do we have them? Do we not have them? What is that?
I mean, obviously, the reason you see childcare and affordable housing up there is because we're currently, there's significant issues in both those areas, right? And so trying to get as many of those those kind of type of developments to move, definitely, there's been interest from council providing incentives there.
And going back to Brianna's point, it'd be helpful to see some actual estimated numbers, like the impact of the rate adjustment for schools, or if we do hotels, you know, by room, what does that potentially generate versus, you know,
Yeah.
having them in a bucket. So it's a little difficult to tell without seeing the actual impact.
Yeah, and we're gonna treat them a little exemptions and discounts. That's more of we're foregoing revenue. So what do we do about that? When we talk about the special cases, that's more of just trying to align to a more appropriate unit for them.
Mhm.
You know, the majority of people fit into the square footage, but when you think of gas stations or hotels or things like that, per pump or per room actually makes more sense.
Right.
And it's a handful of them, but we actually think, yeah, to equate impact, a special unit is more appropriate than per 1,000 square feet. If that makes sense.
But
Okay.
I was just gonna say, to answer your question on whether BDAB provides a recommendation, I would say, I think we should. But I don't know that we can today.
Yeah. We'll go back, because one of the things I guess we can start with is, we can work with a consultant to say, let's start here. And then we can bring some data back to you. We just need to make sure if there's anything big that anybody or BDAB would like us to explore, we'd like to know now, because we're going to start to do some modeling runs and we want to make sure we're bringing back appropriate information. If one just kind of would rather see the raw data based off of these initial inputs, that's where we would start.
Yeah, I think from the exemptions, and maybe on the 14th, there will be some information on there, as well as the target sector analysis, being able to identify what what is the greatest need and what does that look like? And then having a monetary value of the impact of having the exemptions would be important.
Mhm.
And then I think I heard you ask about the, like how many categories. I guess I don't have a specific number of categories, but it seems like there's probably a methodology between this range of categories is the most similar between square footage and trip generation, and we can lump those together. And there's a 10%, if it goes beyond a 10% variation, then we're making a new category. And does that leave you with 5 or
And I think
versus 20? I don't know.
I can say it's trying to come back with what Sarah showed before, just like the different type of uses in the trips, and we can kind of say, well, so we're going to put all these kind of kind of developments into this band, right? And then does that seem appropriate for the kind of the impact on the system? So we'll provide some more information on that.
Yeah, I think if there was a baseline, we could say that feels like way too many.
Yeah.
Based on, so maybe we can simplify it beyond that or not.
Yeah, I mean, I'd almost say that 6 to 10 range sounds about right. 22 feels pretty high, like Medford's.
Yeah.
That 6 to
And
10.
no multiplication.
Right,
fee,
yeah, well, just, whatever natural breakpoints they are, somewhere between 6 and 10 categories. I think it definitely makes sense to have these special use cases and maybe erring on the side of more special use cases and less categories, if it has to go one way or another, because that way, I don't know, these ones that can be identified that are very different, that are not gas stations are so obvious. And then, I'd certainly be in favor of incentives for the kind of businesses and developments that the city needs and wants to incentivize. Anything the city can do to cut or to make those types of businesses or developments or whatever pencil better, I think helps. So, I mean, I'd say yes to all of them, to all the questions.
So, and again, the more we layer into it, the more of well, then what do we if we're incentivizing them, what do we do with that foregone revenue, right? Do we increase the total target? Those are the type of questions we want to have. So that's the balancing act. And trying to, as staff too, we're trying to figure out like, what's the right incentive tool for what to kind of spark what investment in the city.
Yeah, I guess that would lend me to how many tools do I know don't like. Do I not know exist, like that do
Yeah.
exist that I don't know exist?
What's the collection at a baseline? Like leaving it as is, everybody gets charged the base rate versus the discounted rate? And it's not a real question, just a hypothetical, like what does that look like? I mean, if you start to incentivize and discount certain businesses or entities, whatever it is, I think it adds complexity to the system, right?
Right.
So if you start with a baseline and say everybody's paying whatever 6% and then you can start to look at, the lost revenue as a number next to what the total collection needs to be to maintain the roads and everything else. I'm leery of discounting anything, because if I'm a business operating on a really small margin, I'm gonna argue that I'm a special case too, but at some point, if you open, that's Pandora's box to be able to regulate all that stuff, as opposed to saying this is a flat line, baseline scenario where everybody's gonna pay the same thing. If we can level all that to meet the dollars needed to maintain everything we're trying to maintain, then maybe it's a little easier to sort of back into a special case here or there. But I think it just feels like you start to really open up Pandora's box. And there's plenty of businesses that are on pretty thin margins to begin with. So any added fee to them is going to be important.
I'm curious if you're listening to any staff discussions around this, because you're saying it's right in line with the conversations where you have like, well, where do you start? Where do you stop these type of programs on? What are the goals? We're the same conversations going on. And what we started out of the gate is trying to find equity, right? Where's the right equity across there? And yeah, there might be a couple things such as affordable housing and childcare where it makes sense, but then how far do you open that door?
Yeah.
But even at that, once it's spread across everyone, the impact is lower.
Yeah.
Could be as a whole, depends on what the number is, but.
And I advocate for just starting as simple and, we can make adjustments down the road if needed, but.
Yeah. And we can go back and give you like specific charges for specific, under a scenario for specific targeted industry or something like that. We can definitely kind of pull those numbers out.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm hearing, just kind of understanding what the financial impact might equate to.
How does hospitals and healthcare facilities fit into this?
Right now, they are based off of a per square footage is right. That's how it's just basic square footage of that building. And then hospitals will have a lower like if you actually go back to the trip generation model, you'll see that hospitals, they have high square footage, but they're actually in the lower trip generation bucket. So you may have a high square footage, but a low kind of intensity cost. And that's what we're trying to kind of level out now, because right now they're just getting charged on square footage.
Right. So what's your name again?
Gary.
What Gary was talking about, like in trying to rationalize a couple things. We keep talking about equity, and that's a portion of it, right? Nobody wants to be unfairly charged a fee. At the same time, there is this notion of goodwill that is implicit in what it is that we're attempting to do, right? Because the goodwill is that this fee is going to take care of the broader community, right?
Correct.
As you look at the incentives and discounts, at some point, if there is a goodwill incentive for giving some of these agencies discounts, and it makes sense, because it's hard to sort of argue against giving a child care facility a break on this fee, right? And so it feels like we're balancing or attempting to reverse engineer a pricing strategy that is equitable, but also has a certain level of goodwill, and yet is sustainable.
Correct.
Right?
And.
Exactly.
This seems to be a hell of a task, right? because in order, like, you could start off by saying, just take the total square footage of all businesses and apply a rate, right?
Which is basically what we did.
Right, okay. And then that's your par, right? Your par rate. And then start to figure out from that point what the differentiation would be, right? But then you can't, it can't just be, as we stick to this notion of square footage, there's got to be some, not just equity, but some goodwill where some groups have benefited and others are not. And it's easily explained based upon that goodwill incentive, that folks won't feel, well, that's not fair, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, gotcha. Just make sure I'm seeing the elephant from all sides.
So Sarah, do you feel like you have enough? So
Yeah.
I just want to urge a thing to consider when we're talking about incentives and discounts is this the mechanism in which we want to pursue any type of incentive and discount with what the transportation fees actually being funded to do? There are other impact fees and other things that the city assesses that might be a more suitable mechanism for something that we're trying to achieve in an incentive and discount that we would pursue with the transportation fee specifically. So as we think about that, just want to put it out there that that's something we talk about internally as well.
Just this last few minutes made me think of the cost of doing business and the topic that we brought, like, if we knew what that was and we knew all the different
Right.
pieces of the fees that went into that, then we could probably answer the question on whether or not we really needed an incentive or not.
Yeah, and this, we know we're not gonna have a perfect system, right? We're just trying to find the best possible system we can for the task at hand, which is to generate $10 million of revenue through a transportation fee. 5.3 of that coming from residential accounts and 4.7 coming from non-residential accounts. That's the baseline goal of what we're trying to achieve with this process, and then trying to find out, well, what's the right system to do that. So with that, because I know we're at time, we got other topics. So what we'll do, I just want to kind of summarize what I'm hearing from this conversation is we'll kind of proceed with the kind of the direction that we've put on the slides, kind of tracking that Hillsborough model of maybe 5 to 10 different categories, with the kind of incentives and special unit structures that we kind of outline, and kind of start to bring that back to you at the next meeting to figure out kind of what that would actually look like in terms of bands and how we would link these things together. I just want to stop here too and say, if you would like to dive into anything else in more detail, we're more than willing to do that. And if you would like to, would you like to do a subcommittee type structure to dive into these details? We're more than willing to do that. But this is kind of, I think you can understand like how the conversation is going to go at the BDAB level with the kind of the time allocations we have and the information that we can present.
On the incentives, if you bring some back that you're recommending with the cost of those, it would be good to know what other incentives those specific categories receive.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can
through
definitely
the
do that.
city.
Yep.
So if it's like childcare is receiving an incentive from every level of fee structure, I think that's helpful to inform the
Yeah.
conversation here.
And when you come back, would you also have with the bands and recommendations, estimated revenue?
I think that's going to be on the next one. So we'll see how far we can get. Obviously, we're moving very fast. Consultants teed up, ready to go.
Okay.
We're going to see what we can accomplish with our data and how they're going to try to mix those up and what information. And we'll be working with Cyrus to give you, again, try to get you some information ahead of time to digest before we have discussions on it.
Okay.
But appreciate your tolerance and the speed and the amount of information we were throwing at you here. So.
And we mentioned a few times, but if we want to look at having a subcommittee that dives into this content at a more granular level and can report out to the broader group at the monthly cadence, we can look at doing that. So just would love to hear if that's a direction that folks would want to go. Don't want to volunteer anyone to do anything, but there's a lot to cover, as you guys can tell, and we intended for this to be like a 45-minute conversation. It's been closer to 80-90 minutes, so no, it's great. I'm saying we want to give you more if you want.
Yeah, we want to make sure that you have the information you need to provide an appropriate recommendation. That's our goal as staff, is because a lot of times I know we come here with a lot and we're moving quickly, but we do want to make sure that you feel like you have the appropriate information and background to make the right recommendations.
I guess from a a separate subcommittee standpoint, it would be helpful to understand what other information we would look for and the cadence with which you will be able to provide additional information. I don't know off the top of my head what that looks like, but just, more of the case studies, you're focused on the Hillsborough model, which allows the consultant, I assume, to start to
Yeah.
extrapolate that data and put some numbers on paper. Just running that as you, in real time, as you get that information, kind of back feeding it to us would be helpful as a starting point. And again, I don't know what your calendar looks like internally to say, our goal is to get this data by this date and this by then. And because I don't know that, having a meeting tomorrow, the subcommittee meeting would be beneficial until we know where you are at, I guess.
That
Our
makes sense.
next meeting's in February.
Yeah, I
right?
would
So-
say, it may not be till like the last recommendation that you want to have a couple, it's like, yeah, we want to take a couple people and dive deeper. That's totally fine. We just wanted to put that offer on the table to make sure if there's interest, or again, if anyone has specific questions, I always say, reach out to Sarah and we'd be more than happy to talk to you and set up an individual meeting. Right, Sarah?
Always, yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Now we're going back up on the
Yep.
agenda, yes,
Yep.
so target sector analysis.
So we have Beth Goodman and Natalie Walker from Echo Northwest online. Beth, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, sure can.
Okay, great. Well, feel free to pull up your presentation. Beth and Natalie have been working with us over the past several months. You guys kind of saw initially with Damien and I's presentation, we went over the methodology of what data was being inputted into this kind of initial draft presentation. And we're excited to have Beth and Natalie and Damien here to run through it with us.
Okay, thank you very much. We're excited to be here. So I'm gonna walk through this and try not to dash too hard. I'm hoping that Cyrus, you in the chair there can keep us aware of questions as they come up.
Sure will.
So I'm Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. I am a project director here. I've been working in Bend in various ways for more than a decade now, helping with various different projects over time. So what we were asked to do here is a target industry analysis. My colleague Natalie Walker here, who I may well ask to help answer questions, has done a lot of the technical parts of this analysis. But what we did, this is a very data-focused analysis. A lot of the questions that I know you had from your last meeting were policy focused, and I think those are the questions that need to be asked and answered. Sorry, in the next steps beyond this. But we were asked to look at information about economic trends, some targeted economic trends, and their potential effect on Bend. Identify some target sectors for potential growth industries. You would use those target sectors in part of your economic opportunities analysis, which is a land use document that helps the city ask and answer the question whether you have enough land within your urban growth boundary to accommodate expected growth. And then the economic development strategy, which is separate from the EOA, but very closely related, in my opinion, which is what should we do to support economic growth in Bend over the next several years. And so these this analysis is really aimed to support both of these types of strategic planning. So giving you a little bit of context, some of this is information that won't necessarily surprise you, but just easing into this a little bit. A lot of the data points that we have here on the left-hand side, they're easier to see in print, and they're certainly present in the report that we'll have out for you later on this month. But what we see here is Bend's growth since 2007 is really mirrored in the growth of Deschutes County in Central Oregon. That's not surprising because Bend is such a large part of the Central Oregon region. And what you see is that Bend grew at about 2% per year, which is a little faster than Deschutes County and Central Oregon and a lot faster than Oregon as a whole. None of that should be surprising, I would expect. When we look at the state's forecasts for growth projections in Central Oregon, what we're seeing is that the state is forecasting growth of nearly 11% overall growth over the next 10 years, or 2022 to 32. And the industries that are expected to grow fastest are things like leisure and hospitality, health services, professional services, that kind of thing. And those are in the light green, and in the darker green are the industries that are expected to grow, but a little slower than average. Things like trade, transportation, and utilities and manufacturing. So we're keeping in mind that kind of information as we're going through and identifying potential growth industries. We're also looking at what are some of the bigger trends that are going on that are affecting economic development across Oregon, but also especially in Bend. So one of those is, you won't be surprised to hear that our population is aging. So even if we have slower growth in the future than we've had in the past, you'd still have an ongoing need for replacement workers. So even with slower employment growth, the labor market's going to remain relatively tight. And of course, Bend and Central Oregon have a larger share of older workers than you do across the state in general and nationally. You do have or older people. You do have a slightly younger than average workforce in Deschutes County, and I would say that is reflective of who's attracted to Bend. We think about commuting because commuting is pretty important. And what we see here is that there's about 26,000 people who live and work in Bend, about 17,000 people who live in Bend that commute somewhere outside of Bend for work. It could be to unincorporated Deschutes County. It could be to places like Redmond or Portland. It could be all kinds of other things. About 27,900 people commute into Bend for work. They could live again in unincorporated Deschutes County. They could also live in places like Redmond or Portland or Prineville. This information doesn't account very well at this point for remote work, hybrid work, telecommuting, that kind of thing. We've got that coming up in just a moment. This information is as of 2021, which of course we see is sort of in the middle of a lot of change that we've seen resulting from the pandemic. So when we think about remote work, pre-pandemic, 7% of Oregon's workforce was remote, which is a little bit higher than the US, and 12% of Bend's workforce was remote. Looking at 2023, we see 28% of Bend's workforce is working from home, 24% for Deschutes County and 18% for Oregon. This doesn't do a great job of sussing out the difference between full-time work from home. So my husband, for instance, he's worked from home since we moved back to Eugene 26 years ago, and his job is in San Diego. Versus a hybrid work from home, which Natalie, for instance, she works in the office. She's in our office today, and sometimes she works from home. Those kind of details really aren't reflected well in any of the data that we can get. What we can look at a little bit is remote workers by industry. This is for Deschutes County so that we have a little bit of a bigger area to look at. And you're not surprised, at least I'm not surprised, to see professional, technical, and services, 45% of people indicating that they're remote workers of some sort. What fascinated me was the idea that 23% of manufacturing employees in Deschutes County indicated that they were remote workers. We had to do some thinking about that and think about what that means in the context of Bend. And what I would say that means is people who are doing management of manufacturing people who are doing design for things that go into manufacturing. So my hydro flask is, comes out of Bend. Obviously, it's not manufactured in Bend, but presumably there's some design that goes on in Bend. So you can see some industries where remote work is more common. Some of them are a little surprising, some of them aren't as surprising. We know that remote work is a feature that is here to stay and is going to influence our economy as we go forward. And then thinking about the macroeconomic shifts across Oregon, basically what we're seeing is that timber and high-tech industries, they're seeing slower job growth across the state, but federal and state investments, are expected to benefit these industries and may drive some job growth. So maybe our forecasts and projections across the state, maybe those will be a little bit different in actuality than we're expecting because of public policy. When we look at the shifting high growth industries from 2015 to 22 in Oregon, you see things like management of companies. It's a really big number because the beginning number of people in management of companies was pretty small. Food and beverage manufacturing. When I go to Bend and I think of Bend, I sometimes think of food and beverage manufacturing. People like to go to their pubs, their distilleries, the restaurants, that kind of thing. Healthcare, and then you see some declines in computer and wood products manufacturing. So as Bend is growing, these changes across the state are, of course, going to affect the future in Bend. And let's see, small business and entrepreneurship is important across the state, but I would say it's especially important in Bend because you've got such a large share of small businesses in Bend. So we are looking here, this big graph is looking at share of employment by firm sizes in Bend. And it's looking at the number of establishments, so, businesses, and then looking at the number of employees total. So what you see here is you got quite a lot of employees who are at businesses smaller than 25 people and a lot of establishments at the smallest. Those tend to be professional and other service businesses. Your leisure and hospitality businesses tend to be more in the middle. And then you've got a few larger industries that have larger amounts of employment, like your hospital, that kind of thing, down here at the bottom. And so Bend is really, it's a hub of entrepreneurship. So as we're thinking about economic development in the future, my opinion, my advice would be to think about entrepreneurship, which I think Bend is doing and will continue to be doing. But these are important factors that will affect growth in Bend. And then, of course, climate change. So this is a very short slide. There's a lot to be said about it, but extreme heat and drought are affecting tourism. Things like your natural hazards, like I heard that you guys had smoke most days last summer. Those are going to affect tourism, of course, and also cause property damage, affecting agricultural and water resources, which could affect manufacturing of various agricultural products, that kind of thing. So keeping an eye on the potential impacts of climate change and ways to become more resilient economically for climate change will be important. I'm going to hop on to the selection of target industries and how we went about it in a moment. But before I do, does anybody have questions about some of the basics? There's a lot more of the basics in our report, which we'll be sharing. Okay. All right. Not surprising anybody here. Not surprising anybody. All right. So as we started thinking about target industries, we wanted to make sure that we were doing this in part based on the best available data, which we used. It's the same sort of data that you just used in your last presentation, the QCEW, or Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, that is reports all employees who are covered by unemployment insurance. That's the best available data about employment for cities, sort of bar none. That's the gold standard when you're doing economic development strategy. So we started with looking at largest sectors. So sectors that account for at least 1% of Ben's employment, because you can get what appears to be something very significant going on in a very small sector. So for instance, information is a small sector for Bend. It's a lot of, it looks like a lot, but it's not going to amount to a lot in Bend unless Bend decides it's going to start attracting large data centers, say the same way that Prineville does. We looked at the sectors that grew the fastest in the recent past and which sectors are more concentrated in Bend compared to Oregon or the national averages. We also looked at what sectors grew more in Bend because of something unique to Bend. So this is the idea of competitiveness. So Bend is more competitive for certain types of businesses than other cities. So I'll contrast Bend and Eugene for a moment, and say for people who want to do technical climbing, Bend, right outside of Bend, you've got Smith Rock. So that's something that's unique in your region. Whereas in Eugene, you don't really have that. You've got some nice columns up on one of our buttes. That's an example, a really easy example of something that's unique to Bend. So we'll talk more about competitiveness in a few minutes. And then taking this outside the context of the data, because the data only tells so much of the story. So we talked to stakeholders from EDCO, from Central Oregon COIC, from the Oregon Employment Department, from Business Oregon, the Bend Chamber, and OSU Cascades. And we heard different things from each of the different stakeholders, and we've incorporated the different ideas throughout our analysis. But we commonly heard in the end that we were going the right direction. In other words, there weren't things that the stakeholders identified as being large or medium issues or sectors that were missing. So our stakeholders told us more of what we needed to know to help contextualize some of this and made sure we were going the right direction. So looking at the 6 largest sectors by employment in Bend in 2022, and also looking at this by average wage per employee. So Bend's average wage at about $62,000. Your healthcare and social assistance, that's your largest sector, had above average wages of nearly $80,000. Your next 2, retail, trade, and accommodations and food services, those had below average wages. Professional and scientific and technical services, construction and manufacturing. Those were your next 3 largest sectors. The first 2 had above average wages, and manufacturing has about very near to average wages in Bend. So we looked at that. We looked at the change in employment by group between 2007 and 2022. We also did some looking at changes of employment from 2015 to 2022 to get something that was both long-term and a little bit shorter term. And not surprisingly enough, we picked out health and education, professional and business services, leisure and hospitality, where you were seeing the largest consistent annual employment changes, followed by things like retail, trade, that kind of thing. And just in case you're thinking, hey, retail trade, isn't there a big trend that's going on there that will affect Bend? That is considered in this analysis. And it's, of course, more online online purchasing of retail that's been going on since the since the turn of the century, certainly. It's just not something that's affecting Bend in a special way that's different than the other bigger trends than we were talking about. All right, so then thinking about concentration. For those of you who like economics, this analysis is called the location quotient. It's an indicator of concentration comparing Bend to the US and changes between 2015 to 2022. And so what we're showing here in this upper right-hand quadrant are the industries that have higher concentration than you'd expect in Bend compared to the US, and where you had larger amounts of growth. So healthcare and social assistance, you have a high concentration of that in Bend, and growth of about 10,000 new employees. Why would you have that? Well, you know, Bend is the regional healthcare center east of the Cascades. So it makes sense to me, certainly, that Bend has a higher concentration in healthcare and technical services. Things like construction, you've had more construction going on compared to a lot of the US. So you've got a larger concentration in it. Things like arts, entertainment, and recreation, you have a very high concentration in it and a fairly high employment change, but it's also a small industry. So that matters, but the amount of potential impact in Bend has to be contextualized. And then we see things like information that you've had a decreasing share of in Bend. It's pretty small, and you don't really have any specialization in information. And that'll be things like publications, you know, publishing, that kind of thing, internet service providers. Data centers often come under there, but Bend isn't a big center for data centers. So we identified specialized industries. Those are sort of anchors of a broader and mature industry. Things like hospitality and leisure, healthcare, retail, construction, and professional services. And then growth industries, places that Bend isn't specializing in quite as much. You don't have as much concentration, but there are opportunities for future growth. So management of companies, that's things like headquarters and that kind of thing. Arts and entertainments, and other types of professional services. Every time we looked at this, people said, well, let's look more at professional services and some of the particular sectors. Now, recognize that some of these sectors, their names are very geeky, well, we'll just leave it there. Their names are very geeky in a lot of ways. You've got a high concentration in scientific research and development services. That frankly doesn't surprise me. And why, might you say, do we have that and other professional and scientific services? Well, Bend's a nice place to live. If you can afford to, and you know, the people who run the businesses often can afford to live in Bend. Bend would be a great place to put a business if you know, liked places that were sunny and had lots of outdoor recreation, that kind of thing. So this goes to your competitive advantages. Things like your management, scientific, and technical consulting services, it's similar, sort of similar to these other types of services. A little lower concentration compared to the US, but still a fair number of opportunities. We did the same sort of thing looking at manufacturing. So beverage and tobacco product manufacturing, I think mostly beverage manufacturing, has a very high concentration in Bend and a relatively large amount of growth compared to other manufacturing. Things like fabricated metal products, you had a fair bit of growth, little lower concentration, but maybe there's, you know, some opportunities for growth there, that kind of thing. Furniture and related product manufacturing, little more concentration certainly, but a decrease over time. Wood products manufacturing, the same sort of thing. Some of this is reflective of the changes in timber and wood products across Oregon. So then we wanted to start, you know, thinking about sectors that were really competitive in Bend compared to the US. And so what we do here, for those of you who want to know the technical name, this is a shift share analysis. So we look at the amount of growth, say, in professional, scientific, and technical services in Bend compared to the US. How much of that growth can be attributed to national growth in the economy? How much of that growth can be attributed to national growth in professional services? how much of that growth is unique to Bend? And so what we found is that a lot of that growth for professional services is unique to Bend. You know, more than half of the growth that Bend saw there. The 1,086 is the number of employees that you can technically, you know, say grew in Bend as a result of something unique to Bend. Food and drinking places, management of companies. My best explanation for this, and I haven't looked at any of the data, so I'm not disclosing anything that is confidential data. That's growth of something like Le Schwab. That's an example, moving from Prineville to Bend. Recreation and amusement, construction of buildings. These are all things that have more growth in Bend than you'd necessarily expect from growth at the national level. So something about Bend's comparative and competitive advantages make these industries grow more. So here are some of the wages in the selected industries that we were just looking at across a couple of different graphs. So, you know, average wage for professional services at 92,000, ambulatory health services, which I seem to remember is direct health care of some of the more expensive types, 77,000, construction of building at 72,000, on down to food and beverage retailers and amusement and gambling and recreation industries at well below the average in Bend. So remember, as you're thinking about economic development, you may want to prioritize higher growth industries, but remember that higher wage industries, but remember that your lower wage industries are also an important part of your economy. All right, so before I go on to this, do you have any questions about the data that we just showed you?
Seeing none, Beth.
Okay. Then our stakeholder input, what did we hear? So we heard that biotech industry had potential for growth. It's an emerging industry in Bend, and there's further potential for further cluster development. Bend has some manufacturing niches, looking at small scale and niche operations, supported by your entrepreneurial culture and your high quality of life. When we think about large scale manufacturing, really that's shifting to Redmond and other types of cities, in part because there's more affordable land and land that is serviced. I know that large scale manufacturing, large manufacturing sites have been something that have been talked about in Bend over a long period of time, things like Juniper Ridge and that kind of thing. So this, you know, leads to some obvious policy questions about what role Bend wants to play in Oregon and in Central Oregon in particular. Tourism is certainly an economic driver in Bend. A lot of tourist sectors have lower wages on average, but also you can have a fair number of businesses that serve visitors where you've got sole proprietors, and sole proprietors aren't reflected in all of this data that we've just given you. And sometimes that can have better wages. So keep in mind that, you know, tourism isn't all low wage. Certainly, it's also medium and higher wage for different proprietors. And then as we put this together and start to think about the sectors and growth and where you may be wanting to look at. So your leading sectors, these are where you have higher concentration and faster growth in Bend. So things like healthcare, professional services, construction, food and beverage, manufacturing and retailers, and tourism. So these are what's cooking now. When we think about emerging, certainly thinking about management of companies, wholesalers, financial investment activities. These are some of the things that appear to be emerging. You're established that are not growing fast, but still an important part of your economy are things like tourism related, software publishing, specialized retailers. I like that we've got what do you call it? A boot there. And things that are stable are things like nursing and banking. the sort of stable industries are likely to grow with population growth and grow as your demographics change. Another way to look at this is thinking about these big groupings of industries. So tourism and recreation, those include things like outdoor product manufacturing, food and beverage manufacturing, food service and accommodations, and entertainment and recreation. Health systems, things that we've called building for growth. So services that are really focused on building of various types, and technology and innovation. Some of these things are include industries that are in different buckets. So in health systems, you've got bioscience, research and development, where we're focused on delivery. So that's more likely to be something that is a person getting a service that's related to your bioscience R&D versus bioscience research and development that's related to manufacturing or creating new bioscience ideas. So that is an awful lot of what we had. We've got a set of questions for you, but before we go on to those, are there questions or thoughts on this? Are we on the right track, or are you thinking, wow, you guys are really missing the thing?
I had a quick question on how much of the data is affected by staffing shortages or is that data point?
Well, that's an interesting question. So how much are we seeing data distortion because there's just not enough workers? And I don't have a great answer, and Natalie may have some thoughts, she may not, but I would say that, well, I'm going to take that back and say that I don't have a great answer for that. I'm not sure how you get to that. That would be something that we'd probably need to talk to the chamber and EDCO about. Natalie, is it something that we heard a lot about in interviews with our stakeholders?
Yeah, actually, this was especially an issue and of interest, I know specifically to the chamber back in 2022. And so we did bring it up a few times with specifically the chamber and talking to Katie Brooks and the folks at EDCO. And if I'm remembering right, I don't think that it was as much of a concern as it was a couple of years ago. I'm sure that there are places where it's an issue, or specific businesses, specific industries where it's a bigger issue. Getting the data to specifically tease out how much that staffing shortage may affect the employment information is a much more complicated question.
I would actually pose that is something you not necessarily try to get out of your data, but possibly out of your outreach in what I assume will be your eventual economic development strategy. Because I'm assuming, Cyrus, that part of your economic development strategy will be to talk with businesses in Bend and understand the opportunities and barriers for business growth and development.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good question, though.
Yeah. So sorry. So I'm looking at the data. There's descriptive data.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of what happened, and I'm trying to discern the diagnostic data that tells us kind of why it happened. And I'm not sure if I'm seeing. So, for example, it says top 10 highly competitive sectors in Bend. As I read this is descriptive, right? This is saying if we look at professional scientific and technical services, Bend's growth was faster than other regions, correct?
Probably. That's not necessarily something I would take out of here, but that's probably true. And we probably have that information in a different format. What we're taking from here is of about the 1,200 new employees, 12 or 1,300 new employees in Bend in professional services. A lot of them can be attributed to growth that happened in Bend that was beyond what happened at the national level. So yes.
Faster than everywhere else.
Yes, and I, if I wanted to answer did it grow faster than everywhere else, I would just go and look at the actual data and answer that. So this is sort of a more of a getting at how do we think about some of the growth that happened in Bend related to professional services.
You're
And
right. Sorry, Beth, go ahead.
no, and just a fair bit of it is attributable to something that's unique to Bend.
Right, so I don't think this graph is showing the rate of growth. It's showing the amount of jobs that were created that can be attained or attributed to either macroeconomic factors like at a national scale or Bend's unique qualities.
Got it.
No, I don't think I was just looking back through our slides. We didn't present any of the slides that show rate of growth in Bend compared to other places for particular industries. That is information we can have and answer questions though.
And it is in the report. So
okay.
If I'm remembering correctly, I think it has grown at a faster rate than Oregon and the US.
So I guess again, between descriptive and diagnostic,
Mm-hmm.
describing what happened versus why it happened. Are we able to tell why it happened?
That's a really hard one. And no, this is the closest we get to why it happened, other than to talking to different businesses that located or grew in Bend. So the why it happened here is Bend is in some way has some attributes that are more attractive for professional services than some other city. I'm gonna choose Coos Bay because it's a remote area and it doesn't have a big airport near it, and it's on the coast and it's really rainy, so it's different than Bend. So Bend has regional airports. It's not that far from Portland or Eugene. It's on Highway 97. It's got a really high quality of life. All of those kind of reasons. I don't know if I'm answering your question though.
If I'm hearing you correctly, I think what we're saying is that we don't know why it happened at this point. We don't have the data in front of us because it tells to help us understand why. So for example, if I look at the slide that's presented, the top 10, that looks like, okay, this is what had happened. And then if you go to the next slide, it's possible that you can infer that why it happened is because wages grew faster.
No, I wouldn't infer that. In all honesty, wages in Oregon and Bend tend to be lower than the national averages. So I haven't looked at national averages for wages in professional and scientific and technical services. But I'm willing to bet that Bend's wages, while that's a high-paying industry locally, I'm willing to bet that may be at the low end of national average. If you compared yourself to, say, Hillsborough, Hillsborough's wages in that sector are going to be much, much higher because of Intel.
Yeah.
So short of, there's not information in the data that specifically gets you to exactly why it happened. That's much more qualitative that you'd get from a survey of businesses.
Yes. Part of what we're trying to do is then inform goals or recommendations beyond this. So some of that data would be helpful as far as comparing to, what does Bend want to be? Does it want to have more professional? Or when we say, yes, we need to advocate for higher wages. I mean, other than the fact that Bend's expensive to live, what's the background behind why you would advocate for that? And I think what you're asking for would begin to support that.
Yeah, because the next progression would be sort of being prescriptive, right? This is what we can do, given the data set that's telling us kind of why it happened, right? And whether we can change some things or become more competitive in some certain areas. And so I'm just trying to absorb the data, put it in the context of
What are
what
we supposed to do
happened,
next?
why it happened, and what we can then be prescriptive about.
I really appreciate where your mindset's going. And I think to kind of piggyback off of what Beth said, what the work that Beth and Natalie are doing with this contract is really one piece of that broader strategy of, okay, we have this, it's going to help inform something else, and there's going to be other components that go into that broader conversation. So this is just one piece of that. But I appreciate that you're thinking about the next thing of how this can be incorporated and we can have some actionable steps to take.
I would say a really interesting set of discussions with business people in Bend. And I would probably suggest it was discussions rather than just a survey. But might be about, why they're located in Bend, what brought them there. And some of that's already known, and some of that would probably be new and interesting. What they see as the opportunities for growth in Bend, and what they see as the barriers, what makes growing in Bend or locating in Bend harder. And that would, I think, lead to policies about things that the city could do, say different incentives for supporting business. So one of the issues that's going to come out is around access to childcare and affordable childcare. That's certainly an issue that we hear, all across the state. And so a policy question out of that is what can and should and what does Bend want to do around that issue, if anything.
I share that on because I think the challenge is without that SWOT analysis, it's in a collective SWOT analysis, it's hard to sort of figure out where exactly Bend is in terms of being competitive.
So part of that SWOT analysis, a piece of it as it relates to things related to land, certainly would come out of your economic opportunities analysis. And I would think that a big piece of your economic development strategy would be doing that SWOT analysis. So I think the reason we're asking about questions here is so that we can make good recommendations for next steps. So I think a clear recommendation that will include is more details about that kind of analysis. So are there other things that you think Ben needs more information about as we're setting up the next step in developing an economic development strategy?
I took an interest in your question about equity to access to higher wages. I noticed you didn't have, and I'm not saying, first of all, it's a great presentation, lots of really important data that will help us as we proceed to strategize. But this question you asked us about the increase in equity to equity and access to higher wage jobs. Do you have equity stuff in your data that just wasn't presented, or are you saying is that something we should have you look at? If you're asking that, I definitely think that needs to be looked at in a data fashion.
So when you get to increasing equity and access to higher wage and higher skilled jobs, that usually leads down the road of discussing workforce development and equity and access to workforce development, as well as things related to childcare. honestly, these questions are actually questions that in one way or another you all asked at your December meeting. And we couldn't answer them from the analysis we did. But what we want to do is reflect back these questions and make sure that we're talking about appropriate next steps. Because we can talk about in our recommendations some approaches to policies that would increase equity and access to higher wage jobs. But that's not something that comes out of this analysis. It's a very data intense analysis that doesn't really have a lot of hooks in it, as it is right there, necessarily for equity. At least the kind of analysis we did here, which is limited.
In that proposed economic development council goal that we showed at the meeting last month, there was a specific action item around an economic equity analysis. And so that would be something that we would probably want to look at in that broader goal setting conversation.
It's an analysis that can build off of some of the information on here, but it's a different analysis.
I just have a quick question. I'm interested in peeling back the onion on management of companies in that area. And why it's listed under health systems. Is there more data behind that thinking?
Well, so every company has management. So, my company, a consulting firm, we have management. But what we're talking about right here is things that are like headquarters or regional management. So for health systems, the reason we've got it listed under there, at least in part, is because you've got larger health systems businesses going on in Bend. And so you may well have opportunities for more of the regional or national headquarter type things to locate in Bend for some of those. But management of companies, at least in part, comes in under all of these. And this is the difference between what we can present quickly in a slide versus the discussion that is in the broader report. That was something that we talked about a fair bit when we talked to our stakeholders once we'd gotten to this slide.
Yeah, and I don't have the data, but anecdotally, some of the healthcare health systems locally have been acquired by headquarters outside of our region.
Certainly.
Yeah, I think we're good to move forward, Beth and Natalie.
Okay, well then, thank you very much for your time. And let's see, our next steps on this are that we're working on our draft report, and that at the February 3rd meeting, there'll be discussion of recommendations related to this. And then we'll be taking this to the city council on March 5th.
So recommendations are on this specific data beyond what we've already started, because it sounds like a lot of what BDA's looking for is not actually part of this work. It builds on this work, but am I missing something?
We'll want to have a recommendation basically approving the proposed target sectors that Beth and Natalie have put forward in the report. And then those would be tied to our incentive program around site-specific tax increment financing. So that new development incentive policy would be eligible for businesses that qualify for within the target sectors.
And what I would say you're also looking for is the recommendations on next steps beyond this analysis. Is that right, Cyrus?
Yes, I don't think that'll be like formally adopted by council, but it'll definitely be a part of that discussion.
So really, well, this isn't numbered in pages, but the proposed target sector by cross sector group, that's what we would be recommending or saying we don't agree with, that then fall in line with the incentive program.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
So we'll get the full report before then.
Yes.
We are working on it, probably as we speak.
Hopefully by the end of next week, I think we should have something.
Yes, that is the plan.
Is there anything in here that sticks out to anybody as you want me? Or? I know you asked about management, but like beyond that.
Yeah, I think it's just hard without the diagnostic information to feel confident that these are the right target sectors, but understand the limitations of this.
Thank you for saying that. I was feeling the same way. Like, I'm not sure. Like to your point, if the data is there, and ultimately what the data would be suggesting to us is that these are the areas of investment where Ben is saying there is a value proposition for X target sectors. And that value proposition would come out of that sort of analysis that says these are they're the inherent attributes that make it positive for to attract these other companies, to attract companies, and or these are, like as I said, areas of investments where we want to strengthen that value proposition to talk to these targeted sectors. And I'm right now that this page of proposed target sectors just comes as a next slide, not a extension of the data.
Right.
It doesn't feel like it's an organic extension of the data.
Can BDAP recommend that the next evaluate set of data is actually collected prior to us doing a recommendation for the incentive?
I think that's anything's possible, right? I think maybe it would be helpful to have Jonathan Taylor, who's our urban renewal project manager, come talk about how the proposed target sectors being adopted would impact the development incentive program, just to contextualize how that recommendation would actually be implemented and what the outcomes would be.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like, sure, we could.
Is it like,
Feels like most things where we're, if you put it in a silo of limited information and say, is this correct? Then it's like, well, there's no other data supporting anything else. But really the intent is that we're asking for the follow-up data that would inform, where does Ben want to go? What do we want to do? And we're to make that decision or any recommendation without that doesn't really make.
sure. Yeah, I think that's an absolutely valid point. I will say that whatever is adopted, we're gonna be revising or at least taking a look at the development incentive program on an annual basis. And it is something that we have autonomy in adjusting. So it's not like an end all be all, something we're committing to for a decade or something of that nature. It's something that we can continue to evolve as more data becomes accessible.
So if I could just add in really quick on the future work beyond the economic development strategy with the EOA. This work will help inform looking at our land needs for employment, but it won't be so specific to say that we're only going to have land for these target industries, but at least it'll inform that analysis to say, these are the industries that we think will be more concentrated, growing, important for Ben's economy, and then using that frame to look at our land supply to make sure that we've got adequate numbers of sites and buildings and square footage for those industries.
So to give an example about that, we don't have, for instance, regional warehouse and distribution on here, which tends to require very large sites with direct access to something like Highway 97. And so that what that means is you wouldn't necessarily be looking in your EOA for those kind of very large sites.
What's the data that's included in here currently? When is it from?
2022. When we started the project, that was the most recent data. 2023 data is available now, as of about a month ago. But when we looked at it, there just weren't huge differences between 2022 and 2023 data.
From what's in this report currently, and not to discount what's been done, but it feels like we already know most of the information that's in here.
There is a lot more information in the full report. We didn't want to give you a 3-hour presentation.
There.
For the time being, are we feeling okay about moving forward?
Yeah, I guess I'm just not sure what we're asking us to do. Currently, this is just information, and
Agree. That's what we, that's what we're asking.
agree we got the information.
Agree, we got the information. Yeah.
Yeah, no action needed at this meeting for this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think for an actual recommendation, even to identify plots of land that should be identified for growth, it feels like we need the additional information in the data. And so if this is gonna be used to inform what areas are targeted and what incentives are gonna be, let me see, is it the TIF? That's right, okay, sorry, I just wanna make sure. So, and for the TIF, that we would need the background data to be able to say, this is where it's going, or this is where the city wants to go, because it may not actually be what's happened in the past. I mean, that's part of what it should be informing is the future, which means that you make policy changes to inform where you want to go, not just make a decision based on where you've already been.
And I think that's the large purpose of your economic development strategy, is to have those discussions.
And this is really good background data, I think, for us, and retrospective, and gives us kind of a foundation to start with.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth and Natalie and Damien. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. And then we will jump into electrification when we come back. All right, everyone. Attention, we're gonna go ahead and get going again. We have about 35 minutes for this agenda item. We know it's a topic of interest, so we want to allow as much time as we can for it. So with that, we'll pass it over to Cassie Lacey and Michael Selford.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm Cassie Lacey. I'm a senior management analyst in the city manager's office. I lead our climate and sustainability work. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, everyone. My name is Michael Selkirk. I'm one of the attorneys in the city attorney's office. Nice to see you guys.
So we're here today to talk about the city's electrification work. And this work stems from the city's climate goals. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, the city has goals that were adopted in 2016 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and 70% by 2050. Those are community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. We have a community climate action plan that directs much of that work, but then as part of the climate work, the council included a goal in the 23 to 25 council goals to create policy to address community interests, including developing policy for reducing natural gas use. So kind of at the time they were doing their council goal setting, they were hearing a lot of interest from community members that they wanted the council to take action to try to reduce natural gas use in the community. So we held a work session with the council on March 20th of 2024 to just further scope what that council goal would entail and sort of how we want to start addressing that. And that's what officially launched this electrification policy options analysis project based on the direction at that work session. So when we went and had that work session, what was planned was to conduct a two-phase process. The first phase was a period of higher level research to explore all of the different policy and program options that we can explore to encourage electrification of buildings. And then the direction from the council was also to leverage the Environment and Climate Committee to sort of synthesize that research and use them to recommend to try to narrow that list of all this universe of options that we have. And for them to create a recommendation for council of how we want to pursue encouraging electrification in Bend. And then phase two is intended to be a deeper exploration of those high priority policies with a broader and a more both broader but also more targeted public and stakeholder input. So the idea is that we were starting with a really broad list of things you can do. There's a lot of questions, a lot of input we need on all of those things, but we're trying to narrow that list so that we're not trying to do that deep level of research on 20 different options, but more like 2 or 3 options. So the direction was to use the Environment and Climate Committee to try to take that big list and then narrow it to that 2 to 3. So we completed what we considered phase 1, that narrowing, when we went to the council on December 4th. And we presented to them the research that we did to date with that list of policy options. And then the ECC, the Environment and Climate Committee, came and presented their recommendation. And the direction that we received from the council at that time is that they wanted us to bring both BDAB and AHAC into this conversation to get further input from other advisory bodies on this question about how to encourage electrification. So that's why we're here today. The council has requested that your group as a body provide input into this question of how we want to encourage electrification. And we're going to start that by today, me just presenting the policy options research that we've done. And then we are inviting you to representatives from BDAB to come participate in a joint committee meeting next month with the ECC, BDAB, and AHAC and council members to further explore this topic. So we'll come back to that at the end. But today is really just about sort of like making sure you guys understand the framing that we have and then the policy options that we're working with. So the process to date, just to quickly recap what we've done and give more context, is that the first step was that we, in partnership with a consultant team, did some research of policy options of what cities have either pursued or are actively considering for encouraging electrification. We're focused on residential and commercial buildings, not so much on industrial buildings. The policy matrix and policy report, which were included in your packet, are the deliverables from that stage of research. The matrix includes a really high level evaluation of the costs, benefits, risks, and impacts of each policy option to help inform the prioritization. Our consultant team Parametrics also completed a study of our building stock, which is helpful to try to identify the biggest opportunity areas for electrification. And then we held a couple of stakeholder meetings to further understand the opportunities and risks from some of the key groups in the community. So we held a stakeholder meeting with a business group, the Builders Association, and environmental advocacy group, and then each of the three energy utilities. And then the Environment and Climate Committee held a deliberation process that included 2 of their standing public committee meetings. And then they also held 2 additional working group meetings to develop the recommendation that they delivered to council. So does anyone have any questions? So my presentation is I just have a few of the high level takeaways from the building stock characterization, and then I'm going to go through the policy options and also the high level takeaways from our stakeholder meetings. Does anyone have any questions just about the process and sort of the framing and what we're talking about today?
So what you have in front of you is what we're about to begin with the building stock characterization. There's some more granular data components to those slides so that you have those printed out, and also the policy matrix that Cassie will talk through.
Okay, so I just have a couple of the big picture takeaways from the building stock characterization. The first, one of the first data points is that our most recent greenhouse gas emissions inventory. From that study, we know that residential buildings contribute 28% of our total greenhouse gas emissions in Bend. And then among residential buildings, the biggest end uses of natural gas are space heating and water heating. In the residential sector, cooking with gas contributes a very small amount of greenhouse gas emissions. That changes a little bit for the commercial sector. And then electricity end uses in residential are more varied, but the biggest uses include space heating, water heating, space cooling, and lighting. So the main takeaway from here is just showing that space heating and water heating are really the 2 biggest opportunity areas for reducing natural gas use. And then switching to commercial buildings, our greenhouse gas inventory shows that 20% of GHG emissions in Bend come from commercial buildings. In the commercial sector, the vast majority of natural gas end use is for space heating. Cooking is a relatively larger end use in commercial compared to residential. And then end uses for electricity in commercial buildings are, again, more varied. The biggest uses are ventilation, lighting, and cooling. And then this graph shows which commercial segments contribute to the greatest greenhouse gas emissions in our community and breaks down what energy end uses those emissions are coming from. So if you look closely, it gives a lot of information, interesting information in each of those bars about what the different opportunity areas are across those different sectors. But overall, it shows that retail, office, and the education are the segments that contribute the greatest amount of greenhouse gas emissions in our community. So the building stock characterization, you have the full report with you. And so we didn't have time to get into it much more detailed, but we have that data and other data from even our permitting data that we can look into more to just help us understand when we're trying to come up with any type of intervention, whether it's a policy, whether it's an educational program, trying to use that data to inform really like what is going to have the biggest bang for the buck if we're going to invest in some sort of programs. Okay, and then, yeah.
On the original chart, obviously transportation is a huge thing. How is that looked at in comparison? I mean, I know we're digging into like the other components, but what was the view on transportation?
Yeah, so with our community climate action plan, that's our strategic plan that looks at all of our different sectors. So we have an action plan that has 42 different actions. We actually are in the process of updating that plan right now across those 4 different sectors. So there's energy supply, energy and buildings, transportation, and waste and materials. So transportation is, I'm not remembering off the top of I don't have it here, what percentage it is, but it's buildings are the largest percentage. Transportation is a very close second in terms of our total emissions. So our climate action plan does have a whole suite of actions around trying to reduce emissions from transportation. It's mostly aligned with the work with our transportation system plan because that's already a goal that we're doing in the transportation system in terms of trying to get reduce vehicle miles traveled and encourage alternative transportation. So we do have sort of a whole set of things that we're working on in transportation, but largely in partnership with the transportation planning people. I'd say the one thing that comes up in transportation in the CCAP that we see less of in the transportation system plan is also a big emphasis on trying to encourage electric vehicles. So also an electrification topic. Because that's where you can see sort of the quickest emissions reductions in transportation.
Just quick question. Under office, cooking seems to be one of the largest consumptions of energy, and
Yeah.
it's even higher than what you would expect in food services. Like what kind of offices are these?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't, our consultant, I don't have all of the background info on all of the data. So I don't have the answer to that right now, but it's a good point. No one has pointed that out before when we've had our consultant team there. But I'll reach back out to them and see if they can shed some insight into that, like what buildings were covered by that.
Then potentially, like what's the other there for the top part of the office as well? Those
Yeah.
are fairly steep.
Yeah, thank you.
I wonder if it's the color of greens too on this.
No, I thought so too, but ventilation is a darker
I think
forest green.
I know it is weird. Well, I think that big one is, I'm glad you pointed, that one is ventilation, and then the cooking is in office, is that really skinny segment above the purple one.
Oh, so what's
That's the ventilation, which would make more sense in the office setting, yeah.
thank you.
And the really, really dark green next to the gray, is that computing?
No.
At the-
Yeah, I think so, because I do think they go in order of how they're listed at the bottom.
Greens.
Ah,
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Some problem solving there.
Good clarification, Joe.
Yeah, ventilation in commercial is really big, and that makes sense in an office setting for sure.
Okay.
So sorry, is it ventilation or is it computing?
It's that big green one is ventilation. Computing is the one next to the gray.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so now I'll review the policy options that we researched. We compiled this list by starting, like I said, we sort of just looked at a broad list of all examples we could find of things that other jurisdictions are either implementing or considering. And then we narrowed down that list based on what felt applicable to our context. So we have the list that we have out there as our potential policy options are ones that basically made it through our initial research phase, taking out the ones that were just like, it's not applicable at all. It like really doesn't work here. So the list that we have, I just want to acknowledge that we have a lot of questions about a lot of them still. So it's not necessarily like all of these we think we can just go ahead and snap on fingers and do, but they were ones that we felt based on the research we had done were things that could warrant further exploration. And then we're trying to really take it to the committees and the council to help us again, narrow that down and figure out which ones we actually want to explore more closely. So again, and that is part of that phase 2. So that's the part that we're trying to get to now is like, what are the 3 or 4 things that we really want to like hone in on so that we can establish some type of effective programs. So the policy categories include state level advocacy, education and support programs, incentives, local regulations, fees, and building codes. And then there's a lot of the decision-making and sort of analysis of these has a lot to do with sort of the legal framework around some of these options. So Michael's gonna just tee up some comments on how we're thinking about this from a legal perspective.
So I know we have about 20 minutes, but I could probably also spend 3 hours on the legal framework here. Do we have a hard stop at 3? Okay. I will do my best to cover this in 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll try to read the room. And if you seem interested, I'll do 6. And if you don't, I'll do 3. So put aside for this discussion, all of the practical issues, the policy issues. I'm just going to be talking about the law. What is legal, what's not legal, or what is unsettled. So there are a lot of other things to think about. This is just one aspect of it. So the question here is what can we legally do? And we've been keeping up on the current state of the law. This is, I'll say, somewhat cutting edge. We're somewhat on the forefront here. Cases are being filed, I'll say, by the week or by the month. against other jurisdictions across the country that are policymaking in this area. And we don't have a lot of court decisions, which means there's a lot of uncertainty. Because of that, the advice that the city attorney's office has been giving is to be cautious. And there are some good reasons to be cautious here. One is that we want to be successful. So we want to have a policy that has the desired effect. We don't want to be spending time up front, putting all of our eggs into a basket that ultimately is either unlawful or found to be unlawful. And then we've done all of this work for nothing. Another reason is that we don't want to be held up in court. Even if we do end up winning, court can be a long and expensive thing. And we will not have the desired effect on the same time frame that we want to have if we're in court. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Berkeley decision in my 5 minutes, but we don't want to have, if we do end up going to court, we don't want to have an outcome that says what we did is unlawful. That means we can't do what we did, but it also means other cities across the country are operating in a new area or in a new legal basis where there's more constrained options. So as I go through this, I just want you to think through some of the reasons why the city attorney's office is advising that we're cautious in this area because things are so unsettled. So with that, I'll go quickly through the legal framework. Are you all, you can nod or not, familiar with home rule, city home rule authority and what that means? So the highest level, basically in Oregon, Bend is a home rule city, which means I'll say we can essentially do whatever we want unless it is otherwise illegal. So there doesn't have to be a law that says, City of Bend, you can do this. We can basically assume we can unless there's a law that says you can't. So in this area, we're looking at what do we have authority to do? And is there anything that says we can't do that thing? So generally, we have home rule authority to regulate in this area being to serve electrification. We're not a public health authority. The county is. So if our justification for regulating is to help public health, we're on more dubious ground there. But if we were going to regulate for the environment, for example, we have better authority unless we're preempted. And preempted means there's a higher area of law, either state law, which is higher, or federal law, where there's been some statutory authority that says, City of Bend, you can't do that. And the law either says it expressly or it's implied. And we spent hours and hours and hours on all these doctrines. It's complicated, but for you all to think about, let's assume we can unless there's law that says we can't. So I'm going to pause there. I see head nods. Okay, so I mentioned the Berkeley case. I think that is really in the short amount of time that I have where I'd want you all to focus your attention. So there is a federal law called EPCA, or the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. If you look at appliances, they have those yellow stickers that talks about energy efficiency. Those are mandated by EPCA. And that is a federal law that would preempt, because it's a higher level of law, preempt what we can do in this area. So Berkeley, City of Berkeley down in California, passed an ordinance that banned natural gas piping from the meter to and into the building. So natural gas pipes essentially on the property side, not on the right-of-way side. And the idea was to electrify buildings. I want to say it was new construction. They were sued, and they were not sued, and I think this is important, they were not sued by natural gas companies. They were sued by restaurants, California Restaurants Association. Natural gas is used in cooking. And they ultimately, there's a lot of process that happened, ultimately got to the Ninth Circuit, which is the federal appeals that we are in also. And the Ninth Circuit said that ordinance that banned the piping on the property side was preempted by EPCA and therefore was not lawful. And because I don't have time, I'm not going to go into all the analysis, but that resulted in a lot of cities, including Eugene, looking back at what they were doing and realizing, oh, wait a minute, cities may not have authority to ban natural gas in buildings. We know the Ninth Circuit says we can't from the meter to the building, but what does that mean for other ways to regulate? And I think because of how strong that EPCA, the federal law is, it has put a lot of uncertainty into what authority cities have to regulate. And EPCA is just one law. That's one federal law. There are other federal laws that may be at play, Clean Air Act, for example. And then there are state laws that regulate utilities that may be at play. So I'm skipping a lot, but as we go into what Cassie is talking about, what we're really thinking about is, in light of this EPCA decision, what authority does the city have to say to either residential or commercial buildings, you can't install, or you're prohibited from installing or using natural gas? And that Berkeley case says definitely no on piping from the meter to the building, and then a lot of uncertainty. But what about banning in the right of way? What about other types of regulations like NOx regulations? It's very uncertain about what we can and can't do. So we want to be cautious, and just want you all to think about that as we're going through the different policy options that Cassie is going to go through. All right, I did 6 minutes. Decent.
Nice job.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm gonna go through the policy options. I'm gonna stay kind of high level since we don't have much time, but that larger report like explains like a paragraph or two about each of them. So the first category of policies are state level advocacy. There are two different subcategories in here. The first is that since we are preempted in many ways from directly regulating buildings, advocacy that would either regulate at the state level or allow us to regulate directly. Advocacy opportunities, of course, evolve just as things evolve at the state level or other jurisdictions propose different ideas. But the ones that we found that could be explored include advocating for the state building code to increase energy efficiency and encourage electrification through the code, since the state sets the building code, the city of Bend does not. Advocating for legislation that would expressly authorize municipal regulation of fossil fuel use. And then advocating for legislation that would require cooling and rental properties. This is an idea that some cities are leveraging because what they do is they pair the indoor cooling requirements with incentives to meet those cooling requirements with ductless heat pumps. And it's a way that you can introduce a ductless heat pump into a home that may have gas because they need now cooling, and the heat pump can provide cooling, with the goal of, if you have that heat pump in the home, that it can shift some of their heating load also to the heat pump. The other subcategory is advocacy around programs that can provide additional support for encouraging electrification. There's one policy option in here, which is advocating for a statewide financial incentive for all electric construction. This would be rather than individual cities establishing their own city-specific programs, and there could be a benefit to having uniformity around the state to help improve overall awareness and uptake of electric construction practices. Then in the next category of policies are education and support programs. These include programs that range from more general education and sharing information out via website, social media, to more active engagement programs that actually provide more meaningful support and assistance to help people make energy upgrades. The first one in here is a navigator program. This is a program where we would help community members identify and understand electrification opportunities in their homes, and then connect them to available incentives and also support them in getting those upgrades complete. Our research has indicated that there's a lot of need from individual, a lot of the need is really the actual hand holding to get upgrades made, because there's a lot of information out there and a lot of steps involved. And so the concept is to sort of fill that gap where it's not just information, it's like helping people make sense of that information and then taking action. The second one is a technical assistance on electrification targeted at the building and contractor community. When we've spoken with COBA, they have expressed interest in helping us educate the builder community. So I think we have some good partnerships to do that. And then on the simpler end of the education and outreach spectrum, we have just creating educational materials to encourage electrification and then promoting existing state and federal incentives. The next category are incentives to help drive voluntary uptake in electrification. So this involves going a step beyond education and actually providing some sort of motivating factor. We have both financial and non-financial incentives included. The first is to prioritize or expedite permit applications for all electric development projects. This one is more complicated than it sounds. It's sort of a popular idea, but it's more complicated than it sounds. I think that we have some staff concerns about trying to expedite these types of development projects, but it is something that could be explored further. The second one is identifying development incentives such as floor area ratio, height, or density bonuses for new development. And then the third and fourth are city-funded financial incentives, either for all electric new construction or for individual equipment purchases such as heat pumps or water heaters. Those ones would likely require or definitely require a revenue source to create that financial incentive pool. And then the last incentive is providing additional urban renewal assistance for all electric buildings. So that could be sort of looking back at our TIF program and seeing if we could, or other urban renewal programs, and see if we can add electrification as requirements to qualify for those.
Can you clarify the GHG, the greenhouse gas? Are you wanting it to be high or low impact?
That one we got like confused in the key for that one. So the intention is that if it's green, it should be a high impact, like good.
Okay, so
And
green is
that
still good.
Green should be good, but we had some mix-ups in there, so it's possible that the version you're looking at has it like reversed.
Okay.
Because it's like the opposite of the other ones. It's like
Sure.
if it's high, it's good.
Okay.
But the other ones, if it was high, it was a bad thing.
Right.
Okay, the next category of policies are local regulations. So as Michael alluded to, this is particularly the area that has a lot of uncertainty associated with them. So we included them in this list as options, but we definitely have a lot more research to do to determine if they're truly feasible and if they would have the intended outcomes. The local regulations that can be considered are to limit natural gas expansion in the right of way, which would limit gas expansion primarily in new development areas. The second one is to establish nitrogen oxide or NOx emission standards for new appliances. This would be an air quality regulation, and it's an idea that several cities in Oregon are considering. They're trying to model it off of regulations that are in place in California, but the ones that are in place in California are different because they're rules created through air quality districts. So how that translates to a local government in Oregon creating similar rules is a little bit unclear still, but it really is a concept that many cities in Oregon are highly interested in. And then the last local regulation would be to establish a benchmarking or energy performance standard for commercial and multifamily buildings. There's a new statewide program establishing building performance standards for buildings of a certain size in Oregon already. And we do have a number of buildings in Bend that will be subject to those new requirements, but the state law allows for cities to go above and beyond those statewide standards. So we could create a local energy performance standard that goes above and beyond that one here that encourages electrification. And then the next category includes fees. The fees category includes, we have two different options. Fees are thought of as both a disincentive for building with natural gas, but they can also be seen as a revenue generating opportunity for some of those incentive programs or even some of the outreach and education programs. So investing that revenue back into electrification or decarbonization programs. So the two fees that we think might be feasible include creating a new building permit fee for non-electric infrastructure and new construction. This is also one that several other Oregon cities are looking at. And the idea that they are exploring is that the fee could be calculated in relation to the anticipated gas use of the building. So it's sort of like directly for the climate impact that the gas is creating. It doesn't have to be structured that way, but that's sort of the one that's out there right now. And then the second fee option would be to increase the right-of-way fee on the natural gas utility. The last category of options is the building code, and this would involve the city pursuing a local amendment to the state building code to require electrification in new construction. This is technically an option that any city can pursue, a local building code amendment. We don't see it as being a highly viable option. It's a really complicated process to begin with, and our understanding from the state building code officials is that there's a really strong desire to maintain a uniform statewide building code, and the local amendment option is really meant to accommodate specific, unique local conditions. It's not really meant to accommodate policy objectives, and it would be at the state building codes division. It would be their discretion about whether to approve that local amendment or not. And then furthermore, if we ever wanted to change that code, that local amendment, we would have to go through the whole local amendment process again. So it's sort of wonky, but technically an option. Okay, so that concludes the policy options. And then I have I wanted to just share some of the key takeaways from our stakeholder meetings. I have slides for each of them individually, but since we don't have time, I'll just share a couple of notes about the themes that we heard. And we saw the stakeholder meetings really as part of our research process. So it wasn't really specifically about the policy options and their feedback so much as just sort of this idea of encouraging electrification in general and what the opportunities and risks are. So the overall takeaways is that there are, of course, a lot of differing opinions and perspectives about the approach to take regarding encouraging electrification. There's definitely lots of general support for outreach and education. Some groups, in particular, the environmental advocacy groups, were really in favor of strong regulatory approaches, and the main benefits that they were emphasizing for a strong regulatory approach is just the higher effectiveness of driving electrification adoption compared to education and incentives. They talked a lot about how gas-free homes are healthier and more efficient for the occupants. And then just about the urgency of addressing climate change and with their feeling that regulations would be more effective in actually getting people to move off of natural gas. And then lots of support from other groups, all the groups to do incentives and more education. And the main takeaways that were emphasizing those was about concerns about costs and barriers to housing development and the fear that some of the regulations and the fees might, add to some of those costs and barriers, a desire to find solutions that align with other city goals, specifically our housing production goals, concerns about cost to the business community, and then concerns about the legal risk of regulatory approaches. And then all utilities, including the gas utility, express support for encouraging electrification and to a certain extent, but all three, including the electric utilities, cautioned a measured approach. And we just talked a lot about a lot of the constraints and risks associated with certain approaches. Primarily for them, they're in favor of just more of a gradual approach rather than a quick switch to electrification because they all have various barriers to trying to accommodate those, just the shifting energy loads. So like I said, I've got slides of each of the stakeholder meetings if you want to, anyone has questions about those, but to close, just our next steps is that the most important thing for you all to know is that we're planning a February convening of BDAB, ECC, AHAC, and council members to further discuss the proposed policy approaches and determine a pathway forward. I think this group is familiar with the ECC's recommendation, but they ultimately recommended that the council should move forward with sort of a suite of the proposed policy options. Including their recommendation included, they strongly recommended that we should try to pursue one of the regulatory approaches to pursue gas in new construction. So either the right-of-way restriction or the NOx regulation. They also recommended that we created an incentive and education outreach programs to target existing buildings, which wouldn't be subject to the regulation probably. So the council wants to hear BDAP and AHAC's input on whether those are the right approaches, or if you guys have any sort of alternative approach you'd like to put out there. And so we're hoping to get the committees together so that you guys can sort of have a dialogue and get those perspectives together and see if we can come to something, to a proposed solution for the council that sort of balances all of the different perspectives on this. So we don't have a date for that February meeting yet, but we're hoping to schedule that soon. And then I think the idea is that we would have a couple, it wouldn't have to be the whole committee, but maybe 2 to 3 committee members sit in on that meeting. And we can talk about if there's any other sort of prep you guys want to do, if you want, a small group to meet to sort of hear more information or whatever that looks like. So that's our whole presentation. And we have a few minutes for questions, and then I don't know, Cyrus, if we probably don't have time to figure out who or what those next steps are right now.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone just wants to jump up and say you're immediately interested in participating, that's great.
Just says February.
It'll probably be late February.
I'm thinking probably the last week at this point.
So regardless who the representatives are at our next BDAB meeting, it'll be prior to this joint meeting, so we'll be able to kind of formulate as a group strategy or approach that we want to take that has consensus. But in terms of actually having representatives there to participate.
I think Mark said he was interested.
Okay.
I'm glad the attorney's office showed up today. I think that's important because Cyrus got us the 3 presentations we saw today, and of all the presentations, the one that stood out to me was the 3rd bullet on your legal thing. I mean, it makes me say, why are we going down these paths even a little bit? So I assume
The
you're
3rd one is.
I assume you're taking into account, the whole group is taking into account this very major concern. I've been at places to try to lead these things and not good. Hasn't worked out well.
Cutting edge versus bleeding edge.
Yeah, exactly right. You don't want to be the cutting edge.
I think that's, you know, I think the question that we have, you know, it's not just a question about whether we regulate or not. The question is, you know, the council has said they want to encourage electrification. So if it's not the regulatory approach that the ECC provided, having a discussion about like, what is the right approach and what are things.
Like,
we can do.
I think like you showed everybody agreed that your education and outreach made the most sense. Absolutely. And I think that's an important piece. That should, to me, is the focus.
And I think BDAB's letter that they wrote prior to that December 4th work session really outlined that there is potential synergy for what the business community sees as feasible and realistic at this current state. And to ask to have a voice at that table, and that's the direction that we're going. So
Doesn't help that electrical utility costs just went up
Mhm.
again.
Well, that's my other concern is, you know, we've got low income programs, things like that we have to, it all be considered. Yeah.
So for sure, it sounds like Mark would like to participate, Gary. And at our next meeting, we will spend some time kind of formulating some of the thoughts that we want to include in that joint meeting.
And
I
we
don't know
should
if ex
have, like,
officios
by then.
are allowed to participate in this capacity, but certainly involved in the conversation next month.
And we should have, I think, by then, like a clear agenda for that February meeting, which will help preparing for it be a little bit more simple.
Was there any discussion about reducing emissions versus electrification? At city level?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's where it sort of goes back to, we have the whole climate action plan, which is sort of the whole strategy. So I think it is sort of hard to like just pull out this little piece and talk about it in the absence of the rest of that. So this is seen as part of that bigger picture puzzle, reduce emissions, largely because the electric utilities do have state regulation that says that they need to provide 100% clean electricity by 2040.
Okay.
So that's sort of where it fits into a low emission building future, assuming that they can meet those requirements, which is not 100% certain either.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you guys for presenting in your time. I know
Yeah.
we've been here for a long, so it's not your presentation. Everybody's like anxious to go.
Oh, yeah,
so
no, it's a lot, that's a
Get
big
it.
meeting. Yeah. Yeah, okay, thanks.